I want something to start me off in a good mood. I want to talk about one of the highest grossing tours that Jim Crockett Promotions ever mounted and how it started with me having surgery. I mean, you know, everybody talks about the 86 Great American Bash because it was the first big tour. And everybody talks about 88 because it was the first pay-per-view and it was a bigger tour overall with a lot more places. And that's when TBS was heavily involved. So 87 doesn't get a lot of love, right? But it actually, when you go back, it did some good business. So I thought we would go back and look through July of 1987 and figure out exactly what happened. And I have not looked ahead of time through my book here. I haven't read that, guys, because I don't sit here normally during the course of a day and read my old books. So I haven't looked at any of this for a while. So we will see what I recall and what you can prompt, Brian, with your encyclopedic knowledge of everything that ever happened.
Big Red Reese.
He was not on the 87 Great American Bash Tour.
That's right.
All right, let's see here. Okay, it was June 27th, by the way, for those keeping track. We go to Philadelphia. We're at the Civic Center, and that's a Saturday night, and it's a 2 out of 3 fall match with the Rock and Roll Express for the tag team title. That they possessed that then for the NWA World Tag Title. So we split the falls, and then in the third fall, I roll in and do a quick gut shot with the racket on Ricky for a disqualification, and they throw Robert over the top rope, and we start getting some heat on Ricky, and we drop his throat on the racket and steal the belts, and we're going to leave, right? And when the troops come, they send Robert rolls in with a chair, and some other people run in. And the very last kick I throw on Ricky when I see the baby faces coming, right? I give a big one, boom, and kick him with my right foot, but my left leg was straight, and I felt – I never found it because I immediately had to roll out and get out of there, but I felt that the padding had kind of separated in the underneath the canvas, and when my foot hit, it kind of went in sideways. So, but I knew the feeling because I'd done it at Starrcade. I've just torn my ACL. Boom, knee goes out. Oof. And so I get back to the locker room, and I'm like, oh, fuck, again. And what timing, because the Bash Tour starts in like 3 days. So I don't know what the house was that night in Philly because the tearing the ACL kind of took the business out of me. But we got paid $700. So there were probably in a neighborhood of 8,000 people there, I would think. But then the next day we fly back home to Charlotte. But this is how they scheduled things in those days, folks. We were in Greenville, North Carolina, which is all the way out toward the eastern part of the state on Friday night. 280 miles we drove back to Charlotte that night. Then we took Crockett's plane. As a matter of fact, yes, some people took Crockett's plane, but I flew commercial. To Philadelphia the next day, Saturday, did a show. Sunday morning, I flew commercial back to Charlotte and was scheduled to be at a TV taping in Rock Hill, South Carolina at 1:00. But since I'd torn the fucking ligament, it was huge, and I was in the process of getting it drained and et cetera. I didn't make the TV taping. But then after they did 2 hours of TV in Rock Hill from 2 to 4, they took Crockett's plane and went to Wilmington, North Carolina, back literally. We've been to Philadelphia, right? They went back literally within a fucking hour's drive of Greenville, North Carolina for Sunday and did another $29,000 there with the main event of the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express. So that's how they used to schedule things. We did 4 shows in what is that, 72 fucking hours, and a TV taping was amongst them. Anyway, I missed Greenville on Monday because that's when I had the knee scoped. They didn't repair the ligament. This is the one I finally had fixed in 2006 and have regretted that. But they had to go in and clean out the damage because I had cartilage was torn. It was floating around and the ends of the ligament and everything. So they scope it. And the theory is hopefully I can get back in, they say 2 weeks. And I'm like, I got to get back quicker than that. So but Greenville, South Carolina was June 29th. And Columbia, South Carolina was June 30th. And they did about 15 grand in Greenville, 13 grand in Columbia. This was nothing because the Bash tour was scheduled to start on the 1st, right? Lakeland, Florida, July 1st, the Civic Center, a $40,000 house. So back in those, let's say 30-something hundred people. The Midnight Wrestle to Rock and Roll Express, I was not there. But here's the thing. We had made it known to Jim Crockett when I had to have surgery that the last time, such as 6 months ago, I tore my other knee and I was off 2 weeks. You didn't pay me shit. And it'd be nice if I got something because I was injured in the line of duty, right? So I was getting payoffs on the good houses, but not on the shitty houses. So for the expense they went to put on the Great American Bash in Lakeland, Florida and draw 40 grand, apparently they didn't make any money because I didn't get paid.
Wow.
But the following day in Landover, Maryland at the Capitol Center with the Rock and Roll Express and the Midnight Express next to second from the top on the card for the World Tag Team title, and they did $195,000 house, which was a record for the NWA in Landover. And I got $1,000 out of it. I think the boys probably got $2 or like twice what, because I was getting half pay since I wasn't there. But at least I got something, right? Because I'm still recovering. Richmond, Virginia, Friday, July 3rd. The Rock and Roll Express, 2 out of 3 falls for the World Tag title. And Bubba is at ringside, by the way, for these matches. So at least they had some backup there. But Richmond did 125 grand and I got $500. So it's like, half again what I would have got. But this one is the one that hurt because they shot this for TV. And this is the one where you see Bubba roll in and give Ricky Morton the Bubba Slam and his hat falls off. And when he rolls out and one of the Midnight's tops Ricky, and Tommy Young rolls over to count and counts 1 and 2 and then comes up with the hat. That was this one in Atlanta. They did TV at the Omni. The house was $245,000.
Wow.
So like 16,000 people. I got $1,000, but I couldn't be there, right? So that one hurt. And then the next day in Charleston, West Virginia at the Civic Center, July 5th, $95,000 house against the Road Warriors for the U.S. Tag title, where we were defending. And I got $350, but I was not there. And then the 2 I enjoyed not being at, be honest with you. Well, July 6th and July 7th, the Forum in Los Angeles on Monday, July 6th, and the San Francisco Civic Arena on July 7th. And actually, I would have liked to have been in San Francisco. The Forum did $85,000. I don't know if that's enough to pay the light bill in that fucking place. We should not have been running Los Angeles, and especially take the guys from Charleston, West Virginia on Sunday night to Los Angeles on Monday night. $85,000 would have been great if it was Greenville, South Carolina, but not Los Angeles at the Forum. In San Francisco, that old Civic Arena, they did 66 grand, and that was a better atmosphere and certainly a cheaper building. But for fuck's sake, once again, to go all the way to the West Coast, and we had a match with the Road Warriors. So just the trip alone, and with that, my knee still swelled up from the surgery, and trying to sit on the planes or navigate the cabs or whatever, that would have been insane. So we and then they did Atlanta TV on July the 8th, which I was at. So I returned on July 8th at Atlanta TV. So basically, I heard it on the 29th. No, on the 27th. I went home on the 28th. I had surgery on the 29th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 10 days later, I come back to TV. You bastards. You can't stop. Of course, when I wasn't on camera, I was using a crutch to get around anyway. I used it that weekend. More on that later. But anyway, so Atlanta TV, 10 days later, we do the 2 tapes. Then July 9th was Cincinnati. The Gardens this time, not the Riverfront Stadium like they had done the previous year. And it was the Rock and Roll Express for the World Tag title. And this house did 63 grand, which was not by any means record business territory in Cincinnati, but it wasn't that bad. And I got $470 for actually being there on crutches, whereas I made $1,000 for not even being there at the Omni, but the house was 4 times as much. Anyway, so I got my feet back wet at the gardens, and I had Bubba to help me around on at ringside, because I'm basically, the knee is not bending that well yet, so I've got one crutch that I'm getting around on, I think, as I recall, just one, so I could have the racket in the other hand. Then we go Friday, July 10th to Pittsburgh, the Civic Arena, and Brian Hildebrand and his father Regis were there, and this was a semifinal U.S. title match. It says, I have no idea. I think we were the champions, but against Garvin and Wyndham. And Pittsburgh at the Civic Arena did $142,000, which is, I would say, topping 12,000, even at Bash ticket prices, probably topping 12,000 people. Our payoff was $1,035. I forgot to do the inflation calculator, but on exact amounts. But we'd established at the mid 80s, $100 then is about what, $235 today, so almost 2.5 times. So say that Pittsburgh house would have been, by that logic, to over $400,000 or close to $400,000, and our payoffs would have been $2,500 a piece. Saturday, July 11th, we go from Pittsburgh, and this fucking routing. This is what killed Jim Crockett Promotions, was the routing. Friday night is Pittsburgh. Saturday is Oklahoma City at the Myriad. We wrestled the Road Warriors, and they beat us wholeheartedly. And the house was $54,000 because the old Mid-South territory was not what it once was. But that was still a $500 shot. But then guess where we were on Sunday? We've been in Pittsburgh on Friday, July 10th, right? Now we're in Oklahoma City on July the 11th. Where were we on Sunday, July 12th?
Pittsburgh, Oklahoma City. From Oklahoma City, you're either in Minnesota or Florida.
You are incorrect. Baltimore, Maryland, ladies and gentlemen. About a 3.5-hour drive from Pittsburgh, I think is that 4 hours, maybe, whatever. Back in Baltimore at the arena, but the house was $146,000. So once again, that was close to a sellout in Baltimore. And we had one of our only Midnight Express versus original Freebirds matches ever with Michael and Buddy. And we won, by the way, with over Buddy Roberts with the racket. But that's like one of only 2 or 3 matches we ever had with the 2 of the original Freebirds. Just a 2-on-2 match is what I'm saying.
Yeah, wow.
And also somehow Miss Atlanta Live. Oh, that's what it was. On the underneath card, I was supposed to face Miss Atlanta Lively, but since I was on crutches, Bobby filled in, and Garvin just knocked me down at the beginning, and as I just rolled out because I couldn't get up yet, and then he beat up Bobby and pinned him. But he was as Miss Atlanta Lively. That was her last appearance, I believe, on record. And now that we have gone, ladies and gentlemen, for those of you keeping tabs, even though I wasn't there because of injury, we've gone from Lakeland, Florida to Landover, Maryland, to Richmond, Virginia, Atlanta, Georgia, Charleston, West Virginia, Los Angeles, California, San Francisco, California, Atlanta, Georgia, Cincinnati, Ohio, Pittsburgh, Oklahoma City, Baltimore on successive days. Where do you think we were on Monday, July 13th?
I don't want to have to guess again. Florida will be my guess again.
You are correct. Hey. West Palm Beach, Florida. The Rock and Roll Express for the World Tag Team Championship in front of a $55,000 house, which apparently was a record at that time in West Palm Beach.
Really? Wow.
And we got $500. Then the next day, since of course you're in that historic Florida territory, why not go to Baton Rouge, Louisiana? Where we wrestled Robert and Brad Armstrong, because Ricky had actually gotten hurt somehow the previous night, and I can't remember how. I believe it was. But anyway, Baton Rouge at the Centroplex, $23,000 house. So the Mid-South bloom was off the rose there. The July 15th, then we go from one end of the Mid-South Territory to the other, Little Rock, Arkansas, Barton Coliseum. This time it's Robert Gibson and Barry Windham against the Midnight Express, and a dismal non-recorded house. Mid-South was having its troubles. But Thursday, July 16th, the Great American Bash on tour in Freedom Hall in Johnson City, Tennessee. And in 5 years, the home of Smoky Mountain Wrestling in Johnson City. A $72,000 house to see the Bash on tour, and we defeated we lost to the Garvins, Roddy and Jimmy, by disqualification for the U.S. Tag Team Championship. Then, Friday, July 17th, Norfolk, Virginia, the Scope, $180,000 house. The biggest house so far of the whole Bash tour was in Norfolk, Virginia, the Crockett Territory. So naturally, they kept trying to leave the Crockett Territory. Once again, we got $1,000 that night, so that house would have been $400,000. Today, we'd have got $2,500, and we weren't even the main event by far on that one, I believe. And then Saturday, July 18th, Charlotte Memorial Stadium, another of the times that we actually faced the Freebirds, and we beat Buddy again. We got a great record against the original Freebirds, but that was just on the card for our U.S. Tag Team title. That was, my God, I can't remember, but I think it wasn't a War Games main event, but it was a big Flair main event, et cetera, but at Memorial Stadium in Charlotte. And that house was down from 1985 and 86 and still did $174,000. And with the cheap tickets at the stadium, you're talking 15,000 people. And that was down because it had been like 23,000 the year before or whatever. But still, that's for a town you run every month. And we made $1,355. Crockett was like he sliced it all the way down to the nub for us, gave us every penny he could. Then the next day, the only way we could do this was with Crockett's plane, right? We're in Charlotte, so at least we're home where we live that night. But Sunday morning, we get up, we go to the airport, the Butler Aviation section of Charlotte, where they had the private flights come in and out, and get there at like 11:30 or whatever, and get on Crockett's plane, and we fly, an hour and a half up to Roanoke, Virginia, and get there for a 2:00 show. It's the Bash on tour. It's a record $80,000 house at the Roanoke Civic Center. We made $800 a piece against the Rock and Roll Express. But then we had to immediately rush back to the airport and fly to Chicago. And this is how tight they timed this shit. We're just going from Eastern to Central time. We've got a show in Roanoke from 2 to 4:30. You got to get back to the airport, jump on that plane. Boom, there's a couple of preliminaries maybe in Chicago in case of delay, but sometimes you're not changing clothes, right? And go to Chicago, the UIC Pavilion. There's the Great American Bash on tour, a sold-out $136,000 house. And our payoff that night, because we were with the Rock and Roll Express in one of the feature matches, was $1,935 a piece. So people say Crockett didn't do good business in 87, but there was 4 shows in 3 days that grossed almost $600,000, and we personally made over $5,000 a piece just in those 3 days. But the fact that they scheduled that shit like that, if anything went wrong, thunderstorms, power outages, there used to be mishaps just like there are today, Brian. It's just we have more ways to find out about them now, but shit used to traffic jams. But this shit was timed right down to the fucking nub. And then Sunday night after Chicago, I believe that I flew back commercial because there may not have been room on the plane, but we just had to be in Greenville, South Carolina. That was 2 hours from Charlotte. So you fly back from Chicago, go to your house, change your shit in your bag, and then go to fucking Greenville, which did $70,000 the house. We made $655 that night, 2 hours from Charlotte, against the Rock and Roll Express. And then finally had a day off. July 21st is the first day off that we had since, well, for the guys on the tour, that had been the first day off of the month, and mine was for my surgery. What, do you notice guys whining about the fact that they're always on the fucking road these days because they work Thursday through fucking Sunday or whatever?
I was just thinking that, because it's not just what you guys are doing with Crockett, but even like the WWF schedule back then, it was nuts. There were guys who did like afternoon shows on the East Coast and had to fly out to Los Angeles the same day to work the same day. Both companies, Both companies.
Well, and it was worse with them. It was worse with the WWF because they had longer tours. They didn't have their own plane where you couldn't come back some nights to, your home base. So it was worse there. And well, and once again, we get one day off the 21st, right? July 22nd, we do an Atlanta TV taping in Columbus, Georgia. And that did $16,000 for the TV taping. But then the July 23rd, the very next day, we're back to Dallas, Texas at Reunion Arena. And this is for the UWF tag team title with Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner. And that the whole show at Reunion Arena, because once again, Fritz's territory was on its ass also, $72,000. And that's a major city arena. Our payoff was $250 because they probably had to pay to get out of there. And then we went to Houston, Texas the next night. Listen to this match. They were trying to revive the UWF at that point or do whatever they were trying to do with it. But in Houston, Texas, the Midnight Express, Bobby Eaton and Stan Lane, Big Bubba Rogers, and Black Bart, who was at least, had a history in that town.
Yeah.
Against the Freebirds, Michael Hayes and Buddy Roberts, and the Rock and Roll Express.
Wow. And
me and Skandor Akbar in a small cage at ringside. That was one of the mini matches along with Ric Flair and whoever the fuck was there, and blah, blah, blah. $34,000 at the Summit in Houston.
What was it like being a cellmate with Skandor Akbar?
No, it was quite pleasant. I liked Ak. He was a very, very witty man. But they were shooting deer in the balcony. It was just empty. That in 1987, Texas was not the place to go to draw, or the whole Mid-South territory at that point. So we got $250 a piece. And then from Houston to Philadelphia, July 25th against the Rock and Roll, it's a lumberjack match with tennis rackets where we were defeated in front of a $150,000 house. The payoff was $1,145 a piece. But once again, that was pretty close to a sellout in the Civic Center, even at the bash prices. I think the scaffold match with the Midnight and the Road Warriors had set the Civic Center record previously at like $165,000 or something like that. Then the next day we went to Cleveland, Ohio, and they did this once a year for a couple of years. But it wasn't a bash. It was a short show at Municipal Stadium after the Cleveland Indians baseball game. And that's where some of the pictures that you have seen of me and Bob Eaton and Stan Lane and the Rock and Roll Express in a baseball stadium with a lot of people there, but also you can see there's a lot of people ain't there. What is it? Fucking 80,000 seat stadium. But that's where that came from, because we did it after the ball game. And that's when they told me to go out and kill time while they were setting the ring up. And I got the people so right. I said the last people the Indians beat was Custer. And, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, who can you boast of being from Cleveland in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame? Eric Carmen, you bunch of wimps, right? And they started throwing so much shit at me, security had to take me off the fucking field. Anyway.
Eric Carmen.
So it was a $50,000 sold show deal. So we each got a grand for going there and playing around in the stadium that afternoon.
Hey, Jim, that reminds me, this bash tour in 87, I don't recall if they were still doing musical guests at certain shows, were they?
No. Well, and I don't, there may have been one or two. There may have been something in Charlotte that year. I mean, the ones that it would have been a few of them and they would have been targeted. They didn't have Delbert McClinton in fucking Philadelphia again. It was a good idea. It really was, and I copied it to some extent in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, except I didn't use any name bands that I had to pay any money to. But the concept of music and wrestling and, you know, outdoors and fireworks and stuff. That was great. Dusty just overreached and was hiring Waylon Jennings, and it wasn't necessary. They didn't add in their own world. None of those country music fans were coming to see those people unless they wanted to see the wrestling. But a lot of wrestling fans were coming that didn't care whether the country music folks were on it or not. Therefore, they were not selling the tickets, but they were getting an inordinate part of the money. I think after the first year, they came to that conclusion. And then when they had to pull the plug on, who the fuck was it George Jones in Jacksonville, or was it, who was it that I can never remember. I can't tell, but they all look alike to me.
We found out. We got the answer, and I forgot what we determined.
Forgot what we found out, yeah. But anyway, Monday, July 27th. That's where we left off. We go once again from Cleveland, Ohio to Fayetteville, North Carolina against Barry and Kendall Windham, who we defeated, thank goodness. But $88,000 in Fayetteville, North Carolina at the Cumberland County Memorial Arena that Crockett had been running once every 2 weeks, if not once a month, since the dawn of time. Did an $88,000 house, and we made $600. Whereas we had just gone to Houston, Texas, did a house less than half of that, and we made less than half that. And Fayetteville, North Carolina outdrew Dallas, Texas. Fayetteville, North Carolina outdrew, as you'll recall, Los Angeles and goddamn San Francisco. That's what when Flair talks about, and some guys talk about, if Crockett had just never gone west of the Mississippi, that's a simplification of it. But there were a lot of places that we were going that it would have been better to go to Gaffney, South Carolina, and gross $30,000 at the ball field than go to Los Angeles and gross $80,000 at the Forum. I think everybody can understand that, right?
Yeah. Because
of the fact that you will have money left over in Gaffney, but not in Los Angeles when you're at a fucking NBA arena. Anyway, I digress. So then we almost had a day off July 28th because we're in Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is 20 miles from Charlotte. And it's a regular house show against Ronnie and Jimmy Garvin, just a nice 30-minute Broadway. But it was only half an hour, you know, in the car to get there. So that's like a day. And we made $120 because it was a non-bash show at the end of the month in Rock Hill after we'd just drawn 18,000 people in Charlotte 20 miles up the road 2 weeks before. So we went down there and went a half an hour for $120. We weren't even getting paid as much per hour as a fucking plumber at that rate, I don't think. Then July 29th was at Atlanta TV taping. At the Atlanta studios. We did 2 of those. And then the 30th was back in Jacksonville, Florida, but this time at the Coliseum, not the Gator Bowl, against the Rock and Roll Express. And Jacksonville, Florida did $92,000 and we made $600. And then the July 31st was the Orange Bowl in Miami, where we made $800. They still should have gone indoors in Miami. But the fact is there was a lot of people there if it had been an indoor building. So you're seeing that basically the Carolinas and Virginias and Floridas and Georgias, that portion of the business was strong. It was, and the Northeast that we had a foothold in, it was the Western expansion. Anyway, but then speaking of the Western expansion, and by the way, July 31st, the Orange Bowl in Miami is where Bubba was the war machine to take the place in the second War Games, the place of J.J. Dillon, because Hawk broke fucking J.J.'s shoulder with that doomsday device in the first War Games. Anyway, the Orange Bowl in Florida, July 31st. August 1st was New Orleans, Louisiana in the Superdome. And we faced once again Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner for the UWF Tag Team Championship. And I believe it says it was a reverse decision where at first we won, but then we didn't. Guess what the house was in the Superdome in New Orleans, Brian, last?
Oh, my God. Summer of 87?
Yeah.
There's no way. I hate to say there would be maybe 3,000 people there, but I don't know what the gate would be.
Well,
that has to be low.
$42,000. So I think you're probably right about the 3,000 some, if that. Yeah.
How much do you think the expenses were to turn on the lights in the Superdome?
More than that. Well, I know that when we drew $173,000 in April, the last Stampede, April of 1984. Jack Curtis showed me the check made out to Mid-South Sports after rent, building expenses, ticketing, everything they had to pay the Superdome. They left with 126. So that was $46,000 or $47,000 that they paid in some respect. But anyway, we got $400 and we're happy to get the fuck out of there. But listen, once again, here's these last few days. July 30th, Jacksonville, Florida. July 31st, Miami, Florida. August 1st, New Orleans, Louisiana. August 2nd, Sunday afternoon, 2 o'clock in Huntington, West Virginia. Against the Rock and Roll, we did $34,000. So we did in Huntington, West Virginia, 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon. We did $34,000 as opposed to $42,000 in the Superdome in New Orleans. And our payoff was $50 more in Huntington. And then that night we went to Charlotte, our home. And I don't have the house recorded, but it was Rock and Roll Bunkhouse Match, and the payoff was $575. So I'm figuring that was a mid-level house of about 40-something grand in Charlotte. But once again, they go to the Orange Bowl and the Superdome in 2 days in a row and gross more money in Charlotte and Huntington, West Virginia the next 2 days, or in the same day. And then finally, we had a day off on Monday, August 3rd, and that whole fucking tour through hysteria had come to an end. And as I see, and I just, on August 6th, I got my $400 knee brace that had to be custom made so that I could walk, because that was the fucking big issue, was that when I went back on the road, because I didn't want to miss any more of those big shows, and that Baltimore show, and they were going to be not only big payoffs, but I hated to miss the fucking things. But the leg was still, 10 days from having it scoped. So it was still, and tearing it violently. So it was still swollen up. And when I'd either sit on the plane, it would swell because I wasn't putting any weight on it. Or when I would put too much weight on it, like walking through a giant long airport concourse, it was a fucking rib, right? And you could dick around and try to get one of those carts, and the boys would make fun of you. And also, you probably miss the shit because if you were flying commercial, it was split-second timing. It was a little better on Crockett's plane, but that didn't. I didn't have time to do any physical therapy because I'm fucking doing that goddamn schedule. When exactly was I going to go and devote a couple hours to actually doing the shit I was supposed to be doing? So I think that's one of the reasons why it was never one of my favorite knees after that. But it was even though I was getting paid, half price sometimes, which in those days was unusual. If it had been any other territory, it probably would have happened. But we kind of shamed Crockett on that one, and they were doing such business. But in those days, you just wanted to get back. You did not want to miss, but it diminished everything if I was not there with the Midnight Express, when what we were presenting on TV, and if the stipulations revolved around me, so we felt bad about that shit in those days. And now it's just like cards subject to change, and nobody takes it seriously when something's advertised.
Everything you just said really makes you think about the whole idea of survival plan for Crockett Promotions. If they had run the entire East Coast, because by that point, Florida was done and they had taken over that, and they had run as far north as, I think, Boston, and not gone too far west, and stayed the fuck out of the Mid-South territory.
They should have stayed out of everything north of Philadelphia, too. Boston wasn't worth it for the fucking the law of diminishing returns up there, too. Concede that to Vince and build your the economy would have revived, because wrestling was popular in Texas and Louisiana. The idea of wrestling, the concept of wrestling was popular. It was just that the economy was depressed, and the original one territory had gone out of business and been bought by Crockett, and the other territory, the Von Erich scandals had, just left a bad taste, but eventually interest would come back there. If they'd have joined that with everything, fucking that they had on the Eastern Seaboard, they could have cooperated with Jerry Jarrett if they wanted to in Memphis, or just stayed the fuck away from that because they weren't going to do any big business without Jarrett and Lawler. But they had a lot of room. And Chicago, was still doing. It wasn't even until Starrcade that they managed to fuck up Chicago that year when they left Greensboro, where they could do 3 times as much of a gross or twice as much of a gross and tons more people, to go to Chicago, and then gave them a bad finish and killed Chicago after 7 straight sellouts. So it was not a great year with some of the decisions, but they had a still solid business in the territories they should have been running in.
If they had just stuck to Chicago, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Greensboro, Charlotte, Atlanta, and I guess you could throw Miami in there.
Well, really, the whole Florida territory, because Florida was still Eddie Graham style wrestling at that time, and that was fit more closely by the NWA and Crockett and etc. Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, Virginia, West Virginia. As soon as the economy came back around in places like Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana and Texas, also Chicago and a few places in the Midwest, Baltimore, Philly, D.C. as was the capital center, that Vince had run for years almost exclusively, did almost $200,000. So there was in that entire area. Ohio was Michigan even could have been competition, and but Crockett just started going everywhere. And as you can see, not only going everywhere, but how much money did it cost to transport people back and forth across the fucking country, whether private planes or commercial, like goddamn, drunken wombats. It was fucking ludicrous.
Yeah, and it stands out when you talk about the house shows and what those gates were. It's like, wow, if you would really just run those major cities, mostly on the East Coast, and then hit those house show towns and just kept the booking up, which, Dusty and his booking at that point in time is a whole nother discussion, but it seems like that would have been a plan for survival. Stay away from the UWF purchase. And Dallas, look, you got to remember too, Dallas, beyond the tragedies, Ken Mantell goes to the UWF, takes all the top Dallas talent, not named Von Erich, and then they start running in Dallas. And as good as the matches are, the most depressing show ever is Power Pro Wrestling from '86, because it's like an empty Fort Worth. There's no one there.
Oh God. Fort Worth was a depressing atmosphere to do work and do TV in when somebody was there. Unless the whole place was sold out. I saw that once or twice with Flair and Carey on top. Otherwise, it was just dreary on a Monday night to begin with. But yeah, and once again, that's the issue, is that Crockett just didn't have the structure, the infrastructure in place in the office and everything to expand and chase Vince. He was being told by all these people that he had to run big markets and establish the brand in big markets, and the TV revenue would be the saving grace of everything. So they didn't actually really have a survival plan then, because they didn't know they were getting in trouble then. As you'll recall, they didn't know they were in trouble until spring of '88, even though what they did in '87 is what got them in trouble.
Yeah.
So, but the business, I always try to point out that the business, even when people said, in '87 things took a dip. Well, September we went back to Norfolk and did $55,000. Detroit in September did $111,000. That was for that Ronnie Garvin and fucking Flair title change. There was still good business in different places. It's just the schedule got toward the end of the year got so diluted and had so many TV tapings because they'd absorbed so many territories, and they were running more TV tapings than they were major arenas, so they were losing that revenue from 6 months before to fill up all that goddamn television time.
Yeah, because at that time you had, beyond the TBS show, you still had the Crockett syndicated shows. You had Florida TV they had taken over. You had everything that was a part of the UWF syndicated package, Power Pro Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling. You had Kansas City,
Kansas City. There was a TV in Kansas City for a while. Yes. It was ridiculous. And trying to put a history of the programs together, or I don't mean the television programs, I mean the angles between people, the rivalries and the programs and the things. It was all over the page because they were just sending different talent to these different TVs, and it just it was you were doing TV more often than you were doing house shows toward the end of the year, and it just got stupid. But once again, in Baltimore in October, still was $93,000 house.
And then the other issue is they, in one form or another, began neglecting some of those big cities. When you took Starrcade out of Greensboro, you offended those hardcore Greensboro fans.
Yeah.
When you brought it to Chicago and then had the Road Warriors not win the tag titles, you alienated those fans. It was, that was the problem. You didn't take care of those big markets that really could support you.
And, just for example, on October 13th, we did 2 hours of syndicated TV, Crockett syndicated TV in Shelby, North Carolina. Then on Wednesday, we did 2 Atlanta TV shows. And on Thursday, we did 2 more Atlanta TV shows as we were on tour the next week.
Jeez.
Got a day off on Friday the 16th. And then Baltimore did 93 grand on October 17th. And we came back to Roanoke, Virginia that afternoon of Sunday, and then Atlanta at the Omni that Sunday night, which was horrible. That's when Atlanta business kind of sucked. And then started doing TV again. We did TV on Tuesday again that week, and then went to Florida to fulfill some of those commitments. The following weekend, we were Charlotte, North Carolina on Friday night, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on Saturday, and then Greensboro, 60 miles up the road from Charlotte on Sunday night. And none of them really did very good by that point. So
you're throwing away money with that travel schedule. Even if you want to hit those towns that ended up not being that successful, hit them all in one butt. Why are you bouncing from one place back to the other? I mean, it just makes no sense.
They just, I know it's hard to schedule things, but that was what was going on basically. So anyway, what, we've had so much fun. The next time we're going to have to do the Bunkhouse Stampede. That was a whole other kettle of fucking fish.
Oh boy, you want to go in the other direction of fun, I guess.
Yeah, there you go, for alternative fun. All right, I think we've about exhausted that fucking topic. The Great American Bash 1987. Should we go back, Brian? Should we go back? And on this January morning, should we look back when things were still the way they should be?
That sounds promising. Yes.
No, January 1988. Because I thought 30 years ago, let's go back and see what was going on, at least in my world of wrestling. But as we know, the territories were starting to falter. A lot of them were going by the wayside. I think, was it 89 was the year Continental went away?
Yes.
But 88, it was starting to feel that, and even Crockett's business was starting to go down. At the end of 87, business has started to slack off, and it wasn't until the Great American Bash Tour of 88 that things came back, and that's when David and Francis and Jackie tried to get Jim Crockett not to sell because business had come back, but by then it was too late. But that late 87 through mid 88 period, where the TV revenue from the syndication network, commercial revenue didn't come in as it was supposed to. Vince had sabotaged Crockett and blocked him off pay-per-view. He had to get Turner Broadcasting involved to get the Great American Bash 88 on pay-per-view that year. So it was kind of a down period, but when you look back on it today, it's still, it's like, oh my God, if things could only be that good again. But I looked back in January 1988, the Midnight Express and I made $7,000 a piece that month, which was probably the worst month that we had for Jim Crockett Promotions since we'd come in 85. And of course, that's equivalent to, I think it's $14,700 and something or whatever today, but still from what we were used to. And of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we had 7 days off that month because it was freak winter weather in the Carolinas and we were snowed out a couple of days. So 7 days off in a month was unheard of at that point in time. But the money was not too good, but there were some interesting things that happened. Would you like to? I haven't even opened the book any further yet. I wanted to re-experience this with you. Would you like to take a look at it?
Let's take a look at it. I'm thinking of a few January 88 items you may touch on.
Well, January 1st was the Atlanta Omni, New Year's Day as always. And the main event was a cage match for a wild card spot for the Bunkhouse Stampede Finals. Because you remember every year during December for a few years there, Dusty ran the Bunkhouse Stampedes, and whoever won the most of them would be the Bunkhouse Stampede champion. And there was always some doubt. Like in '87, it was Dusty and Big Bubba Rogers had tied, and they had to go in the cage in Pittsburgh and settle the thing. And that was, sell out 16,600 people, $165,000 house. It's still the most people that have ever seen a wrestling match in the city of Pittsburgh, indoors at least. I think they ran some outdoor shows in the 60s for Dusty and Bubba, and Dusty won the Bunkhouse Stampede. Well, it was a wild card for the Bunkhouse finals that were going to be held on pay-per-view. And in the Omni, it was Beautiful Bobby Eaton, Dusty Rhodes, Dick Murdoch, Nikita Koloff, and Black Bart. I love Bart, but one of these things is not like the other in that list. And in the end, Dusty defeated Bobby. You had to throw the guy over the cage or out the door, right? So I'd thrown the racket in to Bobby, and he got some heat on Dusty with the racket, and he got Dusty. And you've never lived until you've seen somebody try to get Dusty Rhodes up on not only the top rope, but to throw him over the top of the cage. But Bobby was trying, and he couldn't do it. So I threw the racket up again, but Dusty got it instead and grabbed the racket and hammered Bobby with it several times and knocked him off the top of the cage to the floor. So he won. Dusty Rhodes going to the Bunkhouse finals in front of a $78,000 house, and that was down. That was probably only about 8,000 people, whereas traditionally New Year's did better in Atlanta. The following day was Asheville, North Carolina, at the Asheville Civic Center. And once again, it was I don't want to say Dusty had just kind of lost grip on the booking, but he was doing some different things and some stranger things. And in this case, Bobby was against Nikita Koloff for the World TV title, and Stan was just on a single match on the card against Todd Champion, who he defeated. But then Bobby put Nikita over for with the TV title on the line. But splitting the Midnight Express up, we did a lot of singles that month, and it was just odd. And the house was only $10,200. Then January 3rd, we went to Baltimore for a TV taping. It was the A&B syndicated shows, Worldwide and NWA Pro. And that was the famous night. It was $72,000 in Baltimore, which wasn't even in those prices. Those days wasn't even 7,000 people. It was a horrible, horrible house. But they had advertised TV taping with a couple of dark matches. So, but that was the night that on the A show, Worldwide Wrestling, Dick Murdoch challenged Nikita Koloff for the World TV title, and they went 20 minutes Broadway. Do you remember me telling you a story?
Yeah, I think so.
we were sitting in the back, and, it's like, and bless Nikita, but we got the finish, and we're like, what the fuck? Because Nikita was not, at that time, an accomplished wrestler. It's going to go, a 20-minute draw in a cold match. I was like, Christ. And Murdoch's like, there's going to be shit. So I said, you know something, Dick? I said, every single person in that locker room, every single one of the boys thinks there's no way you can have a good fucking match with Nikita Koloff going 20-minute Broadway. They do? I said, yeah. I said, I heard a couple of them talking about it. There's no way this match is going to stink, is what it's. Oh, they think that, huh? That was the best Nikita Koloff match that he ever wrestled. If you go back and look at it, I think this aired on January 16th, 1988 by my notes on Worldwide Wrestling. But Murdoch versus Nikita 20-minute Broadway. Now, I'm not saying it was Flair and Steamboat, but it was the best Nikita Koloff single match probably that was ever held. And because I challenged Dickie, because he was going to sit down. I could see, because he was just like, pfft. And so I challenged him a little bit to step up, and he did it by cracky. But that was, once again, $72,000 house TV taping. We made $200, right? Because we weren't advertising the dark matches. And then I believe, because January 4th is off, I can't remember, but we got snowed in one time in Baltimore. That may have been it. Then January 5th, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Midnight Express versus Sting and Ron Simmons. Who we defeated because they weren't a full-time tag team. It was just, but once again, the house was $4,200 in Spartanburg. That was not even 500 people. And I don't know why that anybody thought the Midnight Express versus Sting and Ron Simmons was going to draw any money at that point in time. But anyway, that's the match we had, and we beat them with a double team maneuver. and then went on to Atlanta, where we had started doing the Atlanta TBS shows for Saturday and Sunday. We'd started, instead of Saturday mornings, we'd started taping them on some Wednesday nights. So that not only took another night away from a paying gig, but also it took 2 nights away from a paying gig, because used to we'd do Atlanta TV on Saturday morning and then do a house show on Saturday night, and we'd do a house show on Wednesday. This time, so it was odd, and I never really. I think it may have had something to do with TBS not wanting to bring their crew in on Saturday mornings anymore. But on that particular night, January 6th, we accepted the Midnight Express, accepted the Tag Team of the Year award from Bill Apter. And we had a couple of matches, and I was managing Dick at the time also, and he had a couple of matches. We did the Saturday and Sunday show and got paid a whopping $40, which is what you got paid for Atlanta TV in those days. Then we were off on the 7th. Then we were also off on the 8th because we were supposed to be in Newton, North Carolina, but we got snowed out. This is going to be a recurring theme here. Saturday, January 9th, we were in Huntington, West Virginia at the beautiful Huntington Civic Center. The main event, Midnight Express versus Dusty Rhodes and Nikita Koloff in a cage match. $20,000 house.
Oh,
yes. Barely I'm telling you, business was January and February. We made $7,000 on each of those months. And that's why in March we went in and talked to Crockett about our new contracts, which we ended up signing, which made us the most unpopular people on the roster when TBS bought the company, because our new contracts were for $225,000 a year apiece. And because he thought all that pay-per-view revenue was going to be coming in and all the syndicated TV revenue was going to be coming in, and it didn't come in. But anyway, so we got $445, which I guess would be almost $1,000 in today's money, but on the $20,000 house, because we were in the main event, but still. Of course, we put them over. And then the following day, Sunday, January 10th, Greenville, South Carolina, Memorial Auditorium, 2:00 in the afternoon. Listen to this. We were booked against Ronnie Garvin and the Mighty Wilbur, but thank God something happened, and Sting replaced the Mighty Wilbur. So Sting and Garvin, we got disqualified. Greenville, South Carolina, Brian, the house, $2,800.
How?
300 people. Part of it was weather, because as you recall, we were just snowed out 100 miles down the road the day before. It was a horrible weather month that month. But part of it was 2:00 in the afternoon on a Sunday when there was a Monday night town, half a card because, it was just the B team on the lineup, and the Greenville had been damaged. And, so, yeah, I think that's the all-time low in the history of Greenville, South Carolina. But we went that night back to Charlotte at the Coliseum, where we had another TV taping. See, that's the thing. Here's another thing that affected the houses and the gates in a lot of these major markets, because Crockett had for years been doing TV tapings in little high school and college gyms within 100, 125 miles of Charlotte. Gaffney, South Carolina. Spartanburg was a big TV location. Meisenheimer, North Carolina, where we helped Tully and Arn beat the Rock and Roll for the tag team titles the previous September. We would do 1,500, 2,000 people in those little gyms. They'd be sold out, sometimes sold out in advance, because the people never got to see live action. But then putting all of their biscuits in the same basket, they were trying to do TV tapings in major arenas because they had been told and led to believe, and Crockett had been led to believe, that TV tapings and the syndicated revenue and like Vince, let's do what Vince is doing. So they started doing TV tapings in major arenas, and they'd advertise 1 or 2 dark matches, and the rest of it is see the stars of TV taping. So you wouldn't have a full card. People didn't know what they were going to fucking see. And they're used to these cards that were 4 and 5 and 6 matches deep in big cities like Charlotte and Greensboro and Baltimore and Atlanta, with, grudge matches and title matches. And now, even if they got main event matches on TV, the people who had seen TV tapings knew that they would be shorter matches. And you would have to sit through a lot of squashes with the Italian Stallion. So they weren't coming. I don't even have the house for Charlotte down. We got paid $280 So it wasn't very good. And we had a 6-man tag with Dickie in the Midnight against Brad Armstrong, Tim Horner, and the Italian Stallion. And then we were in the cage against Dusty and Nikita on the B show, which was a short cage match with no finish, where Murdoch had run got the key from the referee, run into the cage, and they had to run us off with the troops. So it was TV matches, non-finishes in major arenas, was not helping at all. Monday, January 11th, we were supposed to be in Fayetteville. We could not be there. We were stuck in the fucking snow. As a matter of fact, I think that is the day that I actually pulled out of my driveway on a street that I lived on, turned left, slid sideways into a ditch, and stayed there. So I got like literally 65 feet from my house. And in North Carolina, it's snow of 6 and 8 and 9 and 10 inches. It closes the whole fucking city down, right? So I don't know if they ran the show, but I couldn't make it. January 12th, North Wilkesboro, North Carolina. Nice little spot show against Ronnie Garvin and Sting. Of course, they beat us because it was a spot show. Why not? $10,200 house. Well, not bad for a Tuesday night spot show, but that's where we should have been doing the television taping. It's where we in towns like we used to. Then Wednesday, January 13th, we go back to Atlanta for another TV taping on a Wednesday night. And once again, we've got to fly down to Atlanta, take the fucking taxi to not Center Stage time, but to TBS. And then, at least we had Crockett's plane where we could get back that night, but blah. Thursday, January 14th, we were going to be against the Garvins in Fisherville, Virginia. But that, I believe, I've got it scratched out. So either the show was canceled for snow or whatever, rerouted, but we were off that night. Friday night, January 15th, we go to Richmond, Virginia, one of the biggest cities and most biggest box office cities in the Crockett territory. And guess what we did? An Atlanta TV taping for January 23rd. $55,000 house, about 5,500 people, let's say. And that's Bobby had tweaked his knee, so he had to take several days off, which is one of the only times I remember Bobby taking time off. So it was Stan Lane and Dick Murdoch against Dusty and Nikita in the cage. And then we did a tag match with Dickie and Stan on TV. And, we were in a dark match. We got $475 payoff, but, blah. Then the next day we go to Philadelphia, where it was supposed to be Dusty and Bobby. But since Bobby was hurt, it became Dusty and Stan, who Dusty beat Stan with a crossbody. And that was a pretty goddamn decent house. I don't have it recorded, but we made $825. Then listen to this one. We've been in Richmond, Virginia on Friday night for a glorified TV taping, right? We go to Philadelphia on Saturday, January 16th for a pretty good house. Sunday afternoon, we're in Charleston, West Virginia for another TV taping, where we basically did a match and an interview and an interview on the B show, and got paid $75 because Charleston sucked because we weren't in a dark match and it was a TV taping. And then we took Crockett's plane, jumped in a fucking car, or jumped in a cab, went to the airport, took the Crockett's plane to St. Louis that night. So we went from Richmond to Philadelphia to Charleston on Sunday afternoon, St. Louis Sunday night. And I managed Dick Murdoch against Dusty in the main event, which was kind of a fucking thrill to manage Dick Murdoch against Dusty Rhodes. And basically disqualification finish, and it was a $400 payoff. I do not have the house recorded, but that wasn't anything special. And from being in St. Louis on Sunday night, Monday, we're back in Columbia, South Carolina, where I managed Murdoch against Sting. And we got disqualified, and $150 payoff because Columbia was – and plus, once again, the weather outside was frightful. Then this was an interesting originally, we were scheduled on Tuesday, January 19th to be off because it was supposed to be a travel day, because that's when they had set up a 2-day tour of the West Coast. And originally we were booked on it, but thank God they took us off. Honolulu, Hawaii, on Wednesday, January 20th at the Blaisdell Arena. Now, I don't know if they ran that show or not. I think they did. But we were taken off and put back on the Carolina team because they had so much talent, they'd run 2 towns a night. But think about this. If we'd have had to, we would have flown all day on Tuesday, January 19th, to get to Hawaii in time to get up the next day and basically eat lunch and go to the building and work. And then the following day, they came back to Los Angeles and ran the Forum. And then we're back the following day and then came back to the Carolinas. So we got taken off. And that is also, by the way, when Bubba left, because you'll recall that Bubba got his payoff about this time for the Starrcade 87 scaffold match with the Rock and Roll and the Midnight. And we all got $10,000 apiece. Well, Bubba was not in the match, but he climbed the scaffold and fucked around a little spot with Ricky up there, and he was part of the team. He got $5,000. And that's around about the first of the year is when he'd got his check. That's when he called Vince and became Hulk Hogan's arch rival in one of the biggest house show runs they ever had. So originally it was supposed to be the Midnight and Bubba against the Rock and Roll and Dr. Death in Hawaii and Los Angeles, but Bubba was gone. At that time, the Rock and Roll had left, possibly over the same fucking reason, because they didn't like I can't remember why they left. So all this shit was falling apart, right? Normally I do good months, but this was a sucky month. So anyway, we got a day off instead of having to fly to Hawaii for no apparent reason. And then while they were in Hawaii, we were in Georgetown, South Carolina, against Ronnie Garvin and Jimmy Valiant, and the house did $16,000 in Georgetown, and we made $300 fucking dollars. And then the next day we were in Chesterfield, South Carolina, against Ronnie and Jimmy Garvin, and the house did almost $10,000, and we got another 125 or whatever. So we actually came out on the better end of that. January 22nd was Elberton, Georgia, where we were originally booked against the Rock and Roll Express, but since they were gone, no. Ricky left. That's what it was. Ricky left first because we worked with Robert Gibson and Barry Windham. And that house in Elberton, Georgia was $11,300. We made a couple of $100. So as you can see, the Carolina spot shows were doing adjusted for rent as good or better as towns like fucking St. Louis. And they still couldn't figure this out. Then January 23rd, Lakeland, Florida. Midnight Express versus Ronnie Garvin and Barry Windham. We were disqualified, and a $50,000 bounty match, Murdoch versus Dusty Rhodes, and Dusty won. $20,000 in Lakeland. Not bad. But you remember I talked about that Bunkhouse Stampede pay-per-view?
Yep.
Here's the way they routed us. We'd been in Elberton, Georgia on Friday night, January 22nd. Then we're in Lakeland, Florida on Saturday night, January 23rd. Sunday, January 24th was the Bunkhouse Stampede pay-per-view at the Nassau Coliseum in Long Island. We went literally as far as you can go from south to north in the United States the day of a pay-per-view. Had to get from the airport to the Nassau Coliseum and set up and go. And if you'll recall, that was what was universally panned as the worst Crockett Big Show ever, right? You remember that?
Oh, easily, yeah.
The Midnight Express didn't even have a match as a tag team on the show. It was Bobby versus Nikita for the TV title and Stan versus Jimmy Garvin in a match that was scratched because they found out they only had like a 2.5 hour window or whatever and scratched a couple of the prelim matches. So the house in the Nassau Coliseum did $80,000. We had no business being in New York. That was Vince's town. We should have never even fucking tried it. That was the first time I'd ever been in the Nassau Coliseum. The people were so cold and so miserable. It was like somebody had held a gun to them to come in. They reacted to nothing. Not that Bobby and Nikita gave me anything to react to, because Bobby was trying, but he didn't do the job that Dickie did with Nikita. 20-minute Broadway on pay-per-view in a cold match with Nikita Koloff for the TV title. So at any rate, I hated New York from that point on. It was not our. It was like I learned in Boston when we had the Rock and Roll Express and Heavily Body Smoky Mountain Tag title match there, and they had probably the best tag team match that had been seen on WWF television in years at that point, and the people were like, "Bleh." And then here comes Doink the Clown and a bunch of midgets dressed like fucking Doink, and the place went berserk. We were in enemy territory. They didn't get fucking wrestling there. They got sports entertainment, and we never should have made the. Anyway, I bet they had to pay to get out of the building that night, much less the fucking talent pay. Now, that was also a pay-per-view. So back then, you didn't get your money for a couple months, right? And that was a pay-per-view that was sabotaged. It wasn't as bad as the Survivor Series 87, where Starrcade 87, where because of the Survivor Series, only like 5 or 6 cable companies carried our pay-per-view. They got a few more, but we saw with that Drismal house, 80 grand and prices up there in those days, that was probably 5,000 people or whatever. And we're thinking, well, this is going to be miserable. We're going to get nothing. We ended up getting 5 grand. For that fucking shitty match. I guess Crockett was embarrassed. It was an embarrassment payoff. But that was the beginning of the end. After that, we didn't do another pay-per-view until June, Great American Bash, and that's when Turner Broadcasting had exerted some muscle and got us full clearances and et cetera. But that's because they were in talks to buy the company.
And again, you had the Royal Rumble, the first Royal Rumble running against that pay-per-view.
Oh, yeah, and that's right. And that was the Royal Rumble was against that one. So, and people have actually said that Vince didn't sabotage Crockett's efforts to get on pay-per-view. And I've heard that from several places. I'm like, fuck, was everybody blind, deaf, and dumb? That's exactly what he did, including going to the cable companies and saying, if you carry this guy's pay-per-view, I won't let you have WrestleMania. And, of course, he was like Trump blathering out of his ass. He didn't mean it, and they all got to carry WrestleMania anyway, whoever carried the NWA pay-per-view. But still, yes, he blocked. That's why Crockett went under, not because of even though this booking from January 88, you can't tell, but between the TV syndicated revenue not being what it was and being blocked off a pay-per-view when he thought this was going to be a gold mine, turned out to be a landmine. That's what happened. Vince sabotaged him. Anyway, so we leave New York, thankfully to God, on Sunday, January 24th. We leave there the next morning, and we're in Fayetteville on Monday night, Fayetteville, North Carolina, against the Garvins, $5,400 house. Now, Fayetteville, by the way, was where, for example, the Great American Bash 86 did $101,000 to see Ric Flair versus Robert Gibson for the world title. Fayetteville had been a Crockett town going back for 40 and 50 years, but yeah. Monday night, half a card. Then Tuesday, we go to Raleigh, North Carolina, for another TV taping. We had cameras up our asses everywhere we went for no money, because all these TV taping payoffs were dismal unless you were figuring the dark match. And even then, it wasn't what a normal payoff for the town would have been, because people didn't want to come see the TV tapings. So that night, we had a 6-man tag with Dick Murdoch, and then Bobby challenged Dusty for the U.S. title. That was the one people have tweeted that lately, where basically there was a reverse decision, but then Dusty knocked Bobby out of the ring and grabbed me and slapped me around and broke my glasses. So that helped us keep some heat there. Anyway, January 27th, guess what we did? TV. Atlanta TV, the Saturday and Sunday show. The one of the shows was the deal with Misty Blue, where she said, "Oh, I'd love to learn how to come off the top rope like Bobby Eaton and do all the stuff that Bobby Eaton does." I'm like, "Well, I can teach you." And she's giving me the finger up under the chin, and I get in the ring and she drop kicks me. And then Dusty and Barry Windham reveal her as the mystery partner for the upcoming show in Baltimore. But so that was fun, but we made $40. And then Thursday, January 28th, we were supposed to be in Harrisonburg, Virginia against Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner. And I've got off, and I believe that may have been a snow situation also. I'm not sure, but we weren't there. January 29th, Pittsburgh, the Civic Center, the Igloo, Bobby Eaton versus Dusty Rhodes. And Dusty went over, and Stan versus Ricky Santana. in just a single match on the cards. Once again, $60,000 house, which was great, for what we'd been seeing, and we made $650, but And then Saturday, January 30th, finally, thank fucking Christ, Greensboro, North Carolina. It was a TV taping, but they had advertised a couple of dark matches. I think Flair was in something important, possibly against Barry Windham. And we did a $105,000 house. So about 10,000 people. Greensboro was back where it ought to be. And the main event that we were figured in was a double bull rope match with the Midnight Express against Dusty and Nikita, which they won, of course. And then also fucking Dusty defended the U.S. title on TV against Bobby again. And we won by countout but then Dusty made his own comeback. No, I'm sorry. We won by countout. But then Dusty made his own comeback and then rolled Bobby up, and the referee counted 3 anyway. You see a pattern here. So we made $1,100 that night, and we were off on January 31st. So we've given you the highs of Jim Crockett Promotions and some of those old days, but that was a dismal, suck-ass fucking month. And by the way, that Baltimore, hold on, let me skip ahead. When was Baltimore? The one that that's right. Baltimore was February 12th, Lincoln's birthday, where we shot that Misty Blue thing for. It wasn't a TV taping, thank God. And the main event was a cage match with me, Dick Murdoch, and the Midnight Express against Dusty, Nikita, Barry Windham, and Misty Blue. That was the main event in Baltimore. The only time we ever had that match. In a snowstorm, once again. We got there, it was 4 inches of fucking snow, and it was still coming down. And I'm like, oh, fuck, right? We did a $103,000 house, made $1,000 a piece. Maybe Misty didn't, I'm not sure. But that was an example of, when they really want to see it, they'll come. But looking back, I think Dusty was starting to get burnt a little bit, and he'd had people leave, and he'd had to change his booking on several occasions, and the whole pay-per-view thing going up in fucking flames. And January, February, March, and April, especially April, as I recall, at that time, it was horrible. And that's when they went into talks with TBS. But then all of a sudden, as they were in the talks, as soon as the end of June came around, and that bash tour, and it was the biggest bash tour that we'd had. I think we've gone over it before, but it was the biggest bash tour we'd had. We worked like 42 and 45 days. The houses were incredible. We set some records. And that's when, as I'm just looking through, Norfolk, Virginia, $105,000. Charlotte Memorial Stadium, $100,000. That one wasn't good. Should have been $200,000. Greenville, South Carolina, $61,000. Orlando, Florida, $83,000. Amarillo, $50,000. Miami, $58,000. Raleigh, $101,000 sellout. Pittsburgh, $80,000. Baltimore, $206,000 for the pay-per-view. Chicago, $100,000. Huntsville, Alabama did $31,000. Chattanooga did $83,000. Richmond did $109,000. Greensboro did $100,000. That month, Cincinnati, $84,000. Philadelphia, $147,000. St. Louis, $81,000. Fayetteville, $66,000. Savannah, Georgia, $58,000 that never drew. Jacksonville, $66,000. Detroit, $103,000. Landover, Maryland, $157,000. Seattle, Washington, $96,000. Oakland, California, $98,000. So the point is, by that summer, he'd put us back in tag team matches, and we'd gone through the program with the Fantastics, and we're about to start with Tully and Arn. Gotten some new talent in. Booking was back on track. The people were starting to come out, and it was too late. They'd already got so far in the hole from that miscalculation over the pay-per-view and the television business, and truthfully and honestly, some suck-ass cards and way too many TV tapings everywhere that nobody wanted to see. It was too late. And as a matter of fact, even off the Great American Bash that year, business got better because in September, when he could bring back Flair and Luger for the world title and started the program with Tully and Arn, the Bash in Richmond, as I believe I'd said, did $100,000, but in September, Richmond did $141,000. We sold the place pretty much slap dab out, and it was the all-time record gate. And 6 weeks later, they've sold the company to TBS. That's what I was going insane about. They're, in hindsight, if they hadn't had that 6 or 8 month period from late 87 through June of 88, it would have been a different ballgame. If they hadn't put so much thought into and put so much faith into pay-per-view and TV syndication revenue.
Well, Jim, Dusty gets a lot of blame for the problems that would happen to the company. His booking gets a lot of blame. And, look, for the most part, to be honest, his booking, there were a lot of holes in it as late 87 into 88, that time period was taking place. But when you look back at the big picture and you see, like you said, Vince was able to keep them off pay-per-view. Dusty and the booking was an issue, but the real issue seems to be the overall office or lack thereof.
The business.
Of an office, of Jim Crockett Jr. having an advisor who could tell him what's a good idea and what's not a good idea, and just a team of serious business professionals as opposed to, oh, this guy's been around for years. He used to work for my dad.
Yeah, Jimmy did one shoot interview here a few years ago where he basically said, hey, it was all my fault. Don't blame the fucking CPA, the accountant that was hopelessly in the hole and over his head. Don't blame everybody else. It was my fault. And that was good of him to do that because it was really, because the buck stopped there. But I don't think Dusty had been booking since 84. So by 87, 3 years of doing some of the biggest business that had ever been done in wrestling. And we know for a fact that because I have it in a lawsuit deposition, that Crockett Promotions grossed $21 million in 1986 on wrestling, not on fucking pay-per-view and not on fucking TV commercials, but on wrestling. And that would be equivalent to around, almost 50 million today. And that was in 86. He was one of almost 15 full-time territories in the United States still operating. And Dusty was responsible for that. And Dusty was he was a great booker in terms of the big shows and the big picture. And he got guys hot and he got guys over and he got heat on heels and he got baby faces over. JJ was there for details, but sometimes you couldn't tell Dusty any of the details. Like the one time in Greensboro, when I went up to him, I said, Dusty, the finish you just gave us with the Fantastics, we did that 2 shows ago here with the Road Warriors. He said, that's okay, kid. They won't notice it's different people. All right. What am I going to say? It's fucking Dusty. And I think he lost his way there for a little while with, like I said, late 87 with people leaving and things changing and plus all the TV tapings. But overall, he got it back in 88 and was doing as big a business for a while there until they sold as he was in, 85 and 86 and a lot of 87. But even if the booking was shite all the way around, it wouldn't have lost him as much money as they spent money that they didn't have yet because they thought it was coming. They bought the second plane and they bought all those territories, Kansas City and Florida, to get the TV syndication, to get all their TV slots. And Crockett had people telling him, well, look how much money Vince makes with this TV syndication. Well, we'll do the same thing. But Vince had a huge front office of people and experienced people, and he was in a big major media center, New York, and he did it first. And instead of chasing Vince and trying to replicate Vince's business model, they should have concentrated on, as Flair said many times, the Southeast, the South, and the Midwest, and don't go past the Mississippi, and it'd been a lot better than it was. But there's no way that Dusty Rhodes just being off booking could have cost him $2 or $3 million. It was the planes and the TV times and the TV slots and the TV tapings and the overall expansion across the country that they felt like that they had to do. And when taking Starrcade out of Greensboro and putting it in Chicago, because the same idiots that said we were going to make all that money on TV syndication said, well, nobody knows where Greensboro is. We need to be in Chicago and New York. Well, okay, so they went to Chicago and did a gross of a third of what they could have done in Greensboro. I didn't think it mattered how big the city was. I thought it mattered how big the house was, but apparently I was wrong. So all those things came in the same year, or in the same 1 year period, from 87 to 88. It just all came home to roost at the same time. So to say that Dusty's booking, unless he held Jimmy down and said, God damn you, you are going to buy a second plane. He might have, actually. But even the second plane wouldn't have goddamn been that bad as related to some of the other things. Of course, they did sometimes. They got so in 86, I remember when they got that first plane, J.J. Dillon called me one time. We were going to Greenville, which was 105 miles from my apartment at the time. Greenville, South Carolina. And J.J. called me about 3 in the afternoon. He said, be at Butler Aviation at the airport at 5 o'clock. We're taking the plane to Greenville. I'm like, what? I said, because it costs like $2,500 an hour to operate that fucking Gulfstream. I said, I'm going to drive, JJ. I'm not going to fly 100 miles. I give my spot to somebody else. And I left my apartment at the same time that they all had to get to the airport, and I beat them to the building. But it was going so good. Everybody was living like a rock star. You've heard Flair say that Crockett's office parking lot over on Briarbend Drive looked like a Mercedes dealership. I was the only one that didn't have either a Mercedes, a BMW, or a Lincoln Continental. I broke down and got a one of those T-Birds when they came out with the turbo. Remember, an 85 T-Bird turbo. And boy, it looked nice. It was bright red. But it only cost me $17,000. For fuck's sake. So when the magazine photographers would come down and shoot something, I'd just open somebody else's door and act like I was getting in their Mercedes. But I will not hear anybody say it was Dusty's fault. It wasn't Dusty's fault, because the guy running the company should have said, hey, you know what? We might be spending too much money that we ain't got coming in yet just because a lot of these people are supposedly smart say it's going to. And Dusty he'd run a big show, but he got big returns. And, like I said, that period, he kind of got in the weeds a little bit, but he was still able to pull out the big shows. And finally, he got it all together and got the wagon circled and got business back up. July, August, and September of 1988, we're doing 6-figure houses in all those places I just mentioned. We record gates in some towns they've been running for years. October 31st or November 1st, whichever day it was officially that TBS took over. Look at and then they fired Dusty the first week or second week of December. Look what they were doing in January. If you want to talk about sabotage, you want to talk about bad booking, and you want to talk about people that didn't want to see shit. You compare January 19, which we might do sometime, January 1989 with January 88, it looked like we were in the middle of fucking WrestleMania season, that shitty month that I just told you about. Nothing happened in January 89 except the bottom fell out of the business and they never got it back because they continued to go further and further away from the Carolinas towns, more TV tapings, and Dusty wasn't booking. And as you'll recall, Jimmy Crockett was the interim booker for about 6 weeks until they got George Scott in, and he pretty much finished the thing the rest of the way off.
You talked about the predatory business practices of the WWF trying to prevent Crockett from getting on pay-per-view. What were your thoughts a couple months later from this when you guys ran the first clash against WrestleMania and it was considered a success by so many people? But what were you guys thinking when you heard the news that you guys were going to, in a way, strike back?
Oh, we loved it. Why do you think that the first Clash of Champions, WrestleMania Day 88, why do you think that two of the matches on the card placed in the Wrestling Observer and the Pro Wrestling Torch and Steve Beverly's Mat Watch and everything else is matches of the year? Because goddamn, everybody's like, you motherfuckers, we'll fix you up. You fucked us on pay-per-view and kept us from these $10,000 and $15,000, $20,000 payoffs. We're going to fuck with you. And Ric Flair not only had the match of the year and made Sting a star, but remember us in the Fantastics? He said, motherfuckers, we're going to show you what this shit's like. And that goddamn match stands up today. We could have dropped a fucking cow in the ring and slaughtered it and not got any people any more excited than that match. And everybody was up that day because they wanted to prove a point. And we did ding WrestleMania that year. We took a lot away from it. And we were happy to do it because turnabout is fair play, as they say.
And that's when your feud with Donald Trump began.
Yeah, that's right. And that's another thing. We were in Greensboro in front of wrestling fans, and they were going fucking hoot and hollering crazy. And they were at Trump Plaza in front of, wasn't that like one of the deadest crowds in the history of wrestling big shows that year?
Yes, it was all the high rollers, however many of them actually were. Yeah.
Yeah. So there was never any doubt that the NWA in-ring product was so much superior to the WWF product during all the 80s. And I'm not knocking the individual talent that worked there. I mean, Slaughter and Patterson in the alley fight match and et cetera, they had good matches on occasion, but anybody with the power of eyesight could tell that the NWA in-ring product was so far ahead of the WWF that it wasn't even an issue. But we didn't have the infrastructure in the office. We still had, what was the goddamn CPA's name? And the three old ladies that were the secretaries in the front office, and Gene Anderson running promos, and Sandy Scott and the Murnocks and a few other people were the local promoters. I don't know that 30 people full-time worked for Crockett Promotions in the office or promotional area when they grossed $20 million that year. So that was the difference, was the infrastructure. The product was far superior, and our coverage was the same. Vince beat us out west and in the Northeast. We kicked his ass in the South and in the Southeast. Midwest, it was a tie depending on the market, and the NWA style was more popular down in Texas. So and the ratings for TBS were just as good as USA's ratings, if not better. And the syndicated ratings were pretty goddamn close. Once again, varied from the market, but overall. So it wasn't a matter of a bunch more people seeing one product over another. It was just the fact that Vince had always had his shit together with his office operation compared to everybody else in wrestling. That was it. That's why McDonald's sells more hamburgers than the fucking guy that makes them from scratch down the block. It doesn't mean they're better hamburgers. It's always been that way. We got beat in the office. We did the job in the office.
Hey, one last question, Jim. Vince McMahon seemed to have had a particular dislike for Jim Crockett Jr. In your time around him, did it ever come up? Did he ever say anything about Crockett Promotions or Jim Crockett Jr.?
I don't know that anybody's ever asked me that, and I'm trying to think. I cannot remember Vince McMahon ever mentioning Jimmy Crockett's name. But now I was with him, next to him, working with him in the office in 96. The war, Crockett was out of the picture in 88. TBS paid him as a consultant to not listen to for a while after that. I don't remember Vince ever mentioning Jimmy Crockett's name because he was all, at that time it was all Turner and Bischoff and what was going on at that time. And I mean, let's face it, I didn't bring up on a regular basis, hey, Vince, remember when we could have kicked your ass except you blocked us off pay-per-view, you fucking prick? I didn't start that fucking conversation. And he didn't need to feel the need to bring it up at that point. So I can't remember Vince ever mentioning Jimmy Crockett's name. I'm sure that Vince probably disliked him at the time because Jimmy he had a dry personality, very dry. And I'm sure he was rude to Vince because he probably didn't respect Vince any more than Vince respected him. So I'm sure in whatever dealings they had, especially over the TBS deal, you'll choke on that million.
Right. Whatever. That's the thing. When he buys the TBS spot for $1 million, Vince doesn't say, all right, thank you, good luck. He says, you're going to choke on that $1 million. Yeah. Who says that to, the person you're making a business deal with? And then I just always look at it.
Well, but Vince, I'm sure, was mad because he was in effect getting kicked off TBS.
Right, because if he hadn't sold the spot, Turner was going to kick him off and make the deal with Bill Watts.
Yeah. And if that had happened, Lord, then I wouldn't be sitting here right now talking about quitting the wrestling business if that had happened.
He knew how to compete with Vince. He knew how to punch Vince back.
Yeah. And plus just the 3 months that Mid-South Wrestling aired on TBS was the highest rated wrestling program ever on TBS. It beat Georgia Championship Wrestling. It beat Crockett's program. It especially beat Vince's. It was the highest rated show on cable. Yeah. Because the wrestling fans knew to watch TBS for wrestling, and by cracky, when they saw that wrestling, they're like, holy shit, this is a whole new world. But, I'm not trying to knock Vince now when I say this, but he doesn't take failure that well. And when I'm sure he thought, because he actually thought, and I know he thought this, and I would hear him say things that would make me indicate there, even though I wasn't there for this, that he thought that when they took Georgia Championship Wrestling off the air and put his product on, just like he thought this in St. Louis, that, well, when they see WWF wrestling instead of this stuff, they're going to go crazy over it. Well, they did go crazy over it. So many people wrote in saying, where is our fucking Gordon Soley Wrestling? Get this fucking New York hogwash off our air. That basically Turner was going to boot him off and make the deal with Bill Watts before he sold it to Crockett, and they got an NWA product back on because it was not any good. Unless you grew up on WWF wrestling in the Northeast, in those days, nobody wanted to watch WWF wrestling over the NWA or Georgia or Mid-South or whatever because it, as I mentioned a while ago, the in-ring product was not as good. And it was more showbiz at a time where people would rebel against that. They would, well, that's fucking fake. I'm going to go watch the real shit that comes from Charlotte or whatever. That's the way they thought. And Vince probably was so fucking wound up about that his product was rejected by an entire region of the country that, he wanted to get even. And he did.
I always wondered if there was something else there, just because there's such a dichotomy. Where they grew up in the same state, both from North Carolina, both from...
Well, that's another problem.
Different sides of the track. Clearly.
Yeah.
Both juniors, whether Vince...
Crockett was a rich kid with a father that had actually raised him and was, well thought of in the whole area. And Vince was in North Carolina on the other side of the tracks and didn't get to meet his dad till he was a teenager or whatever. So I'm sure but I think that's part of Vince's bias toward the South to begin with, because he's like, I wanted to get the fuck out of there. I'm sure he did. But, at any rate, that's the thing. Once again, that is another reason why all the promoters always were supposed to stay and why Sam Muchnick had the dream that everybody would stay in their backyard, because different areas of the country like different styles of wrestling, and the promoters were such bombastic individuals, all of them in their own way, that putting them together in the same room, except in Las Vegas once a year for the convention, was chaos. So you kept them apart, and they each kept wrestling in their fiefdom as strong as possible. And once that it became, okay, everything's open, just grab what you can, well, then it was fucking chaos, and it led to the downfall of the business. And, once again, everybody's, they were a monopoly. Yes. That's the way it was supposed to be done. That's the way it was supposed to be fucking done. And it's never been able to be done successfully any other way by more than one company. Because it was supposed to be, and each area was supposed to be a monopoly. Keep the outlaws out. Keep the fucking amateurs and the goddamn play wrestlers out. Make sure the business is strong and protected as best you can. And if you fuck up your business, at least it won't overlap state lines into my business. Because nobody in my territory knows that you're around. That was the way that wrestling was done. And it was supposed to be done that way, and it still should be. And we wouldn't have many of these problems.
All right. Well, with that said... Hey, can I read you a quote real quick before we go off the air?
Sure.
Because I know your issues with modern wrestling, but this has been sent around, and I don't know if you've seen it. It's a quote from Gato, or Ghetto. I don't know. I never know exactly how I'm supposed to pronounce it. Okay.
Guido and Jado.
Yeah. He, the booker from New Japan. This is a quote, apparently. After the IWE went off the air in Japan, it was replaced by World Pro Wrestling, which showed a lot of territorial stuff in America.
Yes.
That's what I was hooked on. Georgia in particular. Not necessarily the over-the-top cartoonish characters, but definitely the Midnight Express. Now, this was around the time of the first UWF in Japan. I hated it. No interest whatsoever. In fact, I pretty much only liked American wrestling. Compare all the kicks and the holds in the UWF to one bump by Bobby Eaton, and there was no contest for me.
I saw that this morning before we started taping. Somebody tweeted it, and I retweeted it. Yeah, and that World Pro Wrestling show. I still have some of the tapes that, because I've got all the Inoki and Baba TVs for all of the 80s and much of the 90s still on tape. But I would also get the World Pro Wrestling show tape and some of them I've disseminated out of the Midnight Express's matches, but it was great I would think for the Japanese fans. It was sort of like the Pro Wrestling This Week that Pedicino used to do of Japan, where Joe would show all of the different territories and top matches. They would do the same thing, and they would come, and that's the reason why that Midnight Rock and Roll match from April of '86 in Charlotte, where we set the sold out and set the gate record and closed circuited to Spartanburg and down the street to the Park Center, and it was a house show, and it was on closed circuit because Charlotte was so hot. But that still exists on tape because Crockett never never aired it on television, but the World Pro Wrestling people were in, and they would go and they'd get main events from Dallas and from Mid-South and from Charlotte and from all these places, St. Louis. And it was just a great play. Japanese television wrestling in the 80s was the glory hole, so to speak, for the greatest matches in the world were all being aired in Japan. And I'm glad that he felt that way. But yeah, the World Pro Wrestling show was something I couldn't wait to get a hold of, because even if you got those territories TVs, you didn't get those main events because they didn't show the main events on TV. You had to pay to see them. Yeah, that show was fantastic.
Yeah.
And they were, especially 86, 87, they were in the Crockett territory a lot. And a lot of people would turn it up because they had Japanese deals. So if they knew that those tapes were going back, they'd really turn it up or go in and politic about their finish, but I liked the fact that we were on in Japan. We never had any intention of going to Japan, but I liked the fact that we were on because I'd always loved Japanese wrestling on TV. But we never, tried to use that to get booked over there because we were never unbooked over here long enough for it to make sense.
January 1988. There it is.
There you have it.
There you have it.
What we did last week on the show, was we examined, just because it was the 30th anniversary, we went back and looked at January 1988, right? And a lot of people like that is, I love it when you go, and nightly for a month, and we see what the schedule was like and traveling shows and everything. But a lot of other people like that we got into a discussion somewhat, and there's been several questions lately that we've had people write in. Some people, I think we put it up on the YouTube. Our YouTube. We didn't plug the YouTube. Corny YouTube. Go to JimCornette.com and hit the YouTube button. But the headline was, what part did Dusty Rhodes' booking play in the downfall of Jim Crockett Promotions? Because we had fleshed that out a little bit. And I said that, ultimately Jim Crockett had taken the heat, the buck stops there, and that promo he did during the Mid-Atlantic Memories documentary shoot. So Dusty, may have had movie producer ideas. One time he said on the plane, he said, boys, we're flying back from some show and there'd been 12,000 people, wherever the fuck it was. He said, boys, this time next year, we're going to be making major motion pictures and sitcoms. And I swear to God, the next year, I think was the learning the ropes fucking thing or whatever. They were actually making a fucking sitcom or in a sitcom, but he dreamed big, no pun intended. And wanted the best talent, and wanted to have the best, the plane flying back and forth and everything. But ultimately, the guy running the business has to say we can do this or not. And Crockett fell victim, which that was another question that we've fielded recently. Go to YouTube for that. Crockett was led to believe that he was going to make a lot of money when he bought all the territories, Kansas City, Florida, UWF, from the television syndication network, like Vince was doing up in New York. They're making all that money on commercials. And so he bought all those territories, assumed all those TV spots, some paid, some barter, but you've had to fill the fucking time, more TV tapings, et cetera, and the syndicated revenue didn't come because I think while Vince, as we've talked about, had a great infrastructure as far as an office in the big city, Crockett either dealt with the people that had been working for Crockett Promotions for 30 years in Charlotte, or in some cases listened to some of the wrong people, I think, that he tried to catch up to Vince through these syndications and pay-per-views and such. So the TV revenue didn't come in, and also Vince, as we've also talked about recently, sabotaged Crockett on pay-per-view. And no, if you carry this fucking Starrcade business, you will not get WrestleMania. And kept it off, Starrcade 87 off what? Did they have 5 cable systems? The Charlotte cable system carried it. So I got to record it. And then I found out after the fact. I don't even think we knew at the time that all of them were going to not carry us. But it was Meltzer's in San Jose because they gave their word, and like 4 other fucking Charlotte and 4 other places, right? So anyway, so Crockett was sabotaged off pay-per-view, and the Bunkhouse Stampede we had talked about in January 88. So all of a sudden now Crockett Promotions is not on fine financial footing, partially because of these decisions and partially because the booking and the overall shows and the house shows and gates from late 87 through the early part of 88 had taken a turn for the worse, headed south, as they say. So is that a fair summation of where we were talking about before and where we ended up at?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's where we were.
So over the past week, I started thinking about that. It wasn't anybody's one fault. It was a series of circumstances. And Jim Crockett probably contributed as much as Vince McMahon, and Dusty may have had a fucking 15% penalty fucking percentage of responsibility in there. Or whatever, but it's interesting to look at how everybody on those sides reacted once they knew that the business was not good. Even though it still kind of looked good on the outside, they had gone in the hole on money they'd committed and et cetera, et cetera. It looked like the crowds were still half-ass there. Everybody reacted in a different way, and we can kind of pinpoint when we know that Crockett figured out that he was in trouble because of our Mine and the Midnight Express's contract negotiations, as you said before we went on the air today. When we started talking, because January and February we weren't making any money, as I'd mentioned last week, and March was not looking to be any better. And we were on contracts of $100,000 per year minimum guarantee at that point, but that had not been an issue because we had always made well over that with Crockett. But all of a sudden, we're making $6-7 grand a month, and it's looking like it's headed downhill. We didn't have anybody to work with. Our programs were kind of floating after the new year. So somewhere around the middle or the end of March, we started negotiating with Crockett, and he was convinced that even though the pay-per-view attempts had been sabotaged, Turner Broadcasting was going to help him get on pay-per-view through Turner Home Entertainment, and they were still counting on this television revenue. Because when he started talking, he started talking about the syndicated revenue coming in from the vast network that they had, et cetera, and we were all going to make a lot more money than we thought. And over the period of a couple of meetings, and I swear this is the way this went, and we got this on paper. I have this contract. I think I printed a page of it in the Midnight scrapbook. We wouldn't mention a figure, and he wouldn't offer one. He just talked about the TV revenue, and we said, Jimmy, we got to have something on paper. And at the time, they were doing the balloon payments, so he could pay you along as the houses drew, but he had to pay you at the end of the contract the balance that he owed. So he was front-loading the things because of all his TV revenue. So finally, I said, just to be a wise ass, I said, well, Jimmy, it sounds like from what you're saying, we could all make $250,000 apiece next year. He said, Well, I can't remember. I don't have the notes with me as to where our budget was, but I don't think you'd be too far off. And I looked at Stan, and Bobby just blinked, right? And I looked at Stan looked at me, I said, well, why don't we come back, Jimmy, when you've got your notes with you? I swear to God, this is on my mother's grave. This is a recreation of that conversation. And he was being so smug because he knew he was about to have a lot of money coming in and he was going to be, running this fucking big talent roster and et cetera, et cetera. So we reconvened the following week when we were back in Charlotte after promos. And he said, well, I had you guys figured in at the level where you'd be making $200,000 a year apiece. And I swear to God, my first words out of my mouth were, Jimmy, well, fuck, we said 250 and you said 200. Why don't we just say 225 and call it even? And he said, okay. That was how hard it was to get that fight. And we signed the contract a week later. And all three of us, me and Bobby and Stan, walked out in Crockett's parking lot. It was a converted convenience store on Briarbend Drive off of South Boulevard in Charlotte with Mercedes and Lincoln Town cars in the fucking parking lot and Corvettes. And we looked at each other and I said, I don't know if he'll ever pay us all this money, but at least we got something on paper with his signature on it and it's notarized. And it ended up at the end of when he sold to Turner, he owed us $66,000 on our balloon payments. And we settled for 40 cents on the dollar, which I have noted before, but that was $26,000. So he owed us $40,000, but still we got that much extra out of him. And TBS started paying us on our contract amounts to do less work than ever before, as we'll get into. So the point is that was April 15th. We signed that contract. And I've always wondered, he may have either found out just right afterwards because they were negotiating, I believe, with Tully and Arn, and he cut that off for new deals. So he either found out right after he signed ours, or maybe he found out a couple days before. Maybe I've always underestimated Jimmy. And he's like, fuck it, I'll sign this. I won't have to pay him, but goddamn somebody might, whatever the fuck. I don't know. But it was sometime around, April-ish that Jimmy found out that they were a couple $1 million in the hole because of this money that was not coming and all these other things that had happened and the reduction in the house show business and et cetera. So at that point, business is going to get worse before it gets any better, because obviously first thing Jim Crockett does is they have a great relationship with Turner Broadcasting. They're the number one show on the station. They're already talking about getting involved in the pay-per-view business. And because when they blocked Crockett, that was the reason for the first Clash of Champions in March of '88, because TBS gave Crockett the free over-the-air free cable national broadcast of the Clash of Champions opposite WrestleMania that year, because Vince was playing dirty with getting them off of the Starrcade and the Bunkhouse Stampede. And that started the cable wars that we almost had. Remember, between the cable companies and the wrestling promotions, because they're mad. Then we each side started costing the other side money. When was it finally? 89?
89. It started in 80. It started in 87 with the Starrcade incident. And then, of course, Clash of the Champions 1 ran against WrestleMania 4 in 88. And then, of course, the Royal Rumble. Actually, Vince fired back after Starrcade, debuted the Royal Rumble against the Bunkhouse Stampede. Then the Clash of the Champions, finally Crockett fires back, and this time Turner is on his side and gives him that time spot, and it's a huge success. And then, of course, 89, they went Flair Steamboat against Savage Hogan WrestleMania.
From the Superdome, and George Scott wouldn't promote. Anyway, so the point is...
And then the cable company said, cut this out. Actually,
because you're costing us all money. But so Crockett goes to Turner, obviously, as, can we get some kind of financial support? Who knows what the genesis was of the talks, from what, whether it's buy me outright or what the fuck can we do here? But Dusty obviously had to do something, because he's the booker. And I'm sure when he finds this out, he's like, okay, we got to put some money in the building. And the thing is, that's what people don't understand, especially a company that big and that had that many television shows spread out over the week. And the fans were devoted, but you couldn't just turn it on a dime. It took a few weeks for whatever you had taped to finally to air and somebody else to come in or some new angle to be shot or whatever. And also if you just completely slop it out, and I'm speaking as a booker here, but if you just completely slop everything out at once, every change on a fucking plate, like goddamn goulash, you know, it looks like, as Gordon Ramsay would say, a fucking dog's dinner. You can't turn a company that size on a dime booking wise. And if you try to, it looks so sloppy that it just fucking kills you dead in 4 o'clock anyway. So, but you can see what he did. And when I go back and I look at my 88 book, we talked about in January, we made $6,900, whatever the fuck. And I said, oh, Jesus Christ. By May and June, in May, we had 1, 2, 3, 4. We had 5 days off and made $4,975 that month. And in June, we had 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 days off, which I think is the most days we'd ever had off working for Crockett. And some of them, I can't remember why, we'll do that at another show, but some of them were because they were deliberately not running shows at the end of the month because the Bash tour was coming up. And that was going to be like fucking nonstop, right, for 40 days, 45 days. But we made $4,000 in June. So we're on this $225,000 a year contract, but we made less than $10,000 over those 2 months, which was a historic low for our payoffs. Because even though they found out in April, which by the way was a pretty good fucking month, actually, financially, we made $12,000 that month and didn't have a day off. Dusty set about going, okay, sort of like what I told Barnett that one time in that booking meeting. He said, how are we going to draw money next month? And I said, we ain't going to draw any money next month. And we probably ain't going to draw any money the month after. But if we start right now and figure out what to do, we'll probably draw some the month after that. But that wasn't what he wanted to hear. But that's, I think, what Dusty went into it going, we have a tour that's established, the Great American Bashes. And if I can assemble the best talent that I can get in the best way after they'd had some talent changes and turnover and et cetera, and I can hotshot this thing, which is exactly what that's the meaning of the Great American Bashes. That's when you did hotshot, because he obviously hadn't been hotshotting for the past 6 months. He can hotshot this thing. He also knows that Turner Broadcasting is now talking to people. So obviously he wants to be the booker. If a billionaire, old billionaire Ted, if he's going to be involved in this thing in any way, much less buy it, don't you think Dusty Rhodes wants to be the booker, right? That's a fair assumption to make.
Yeah.
So Dusty immediately says, I'm going to put the talent together in the right way. I'm going to make this Bash tour huge, but I'm also going to have some fucking outs because they may not buy the thing, and then I'd book us into oblivion. And B, even if they do buy the thing, the business better not go right down or they'll can me. So he would not only setting up for the summertime, but he's also setting up the fall, and you can see it, right? In what he ended up doing in the fall. But in the meantime, that's the approach that I believe Dusty took. And it bears out by in May and June, we made less than $5,000 a month. In July, we made $17,515 a piece. And of course, we worked all but 2 days. And into August, we followed that up, making almost $13,000 with 10 days off. And in September, we had 8 days off. More on that later. A few of them were a paid vacation from the company, and made $9,000, and half the month we'd lost our opponents, which we'll talk about here in a second. So you can see that he got business back at that point, and that's when a lot of the family members, Francis and David, thought, well, wait a minute, let's reconsider selling this because we got a good talent roster. If Turner, obviously they're not going to kick us off the station. If they'll be involved maybe in pay-per-view, but do we have to sell the company, blah, blah, blah. But they had determined, I think to be honest, it came down to, did they want to risk their mothers and their retirements? I don't believe they were hurting. But so that's when the sale was made. But once again, Dusty faced a different challenge because he starts losing talent again because of the Horseman deal, which we'll talk about in a second. I know I keep saying this, but I'm just trying to give the overview. The Horseman deal and then the changes that they start making, and finally, the clash with Flair. But at any rate, let's go back, because we said some stuff about about July '88 last month in the Great American Bash Tour. I teased some of the houses, right? Is what I'm trying to say, boy.
Trying to say.
Okay, from horrible houses and not really focused booking. Horrible houses, not really focused booking for the first 6 months of the year. We've pretty much established, except there was some bright spots, but business was down. Dusty's got to get people back in the buildings, and he starts the Great American Bash Tour in Orlando and does a record house of $83,000 at Civic Center. Not a bad fucking start, right? And as a matter of fact, I have Mark James's wonderful Jim Crockett Promotions 1980 through 1988 record book, which has all the cards that pretty much ever happened. And I'm flipping to that date now, but I want to recommend that for all the folks out there that love a bunch of results. Anyway.
But can I say something? Can I jump in?
Yes, you may.
I agree with your idea that that the booking got better towards the end of the summer of '88. And look, if Arn and Tully hadn't left, and you're talking about Midnight versus Horseman into the fall and winter, I mean, that's amazing. That would have been great. So obviously things are on that path, but look, I can't overlook the biggest fucking mistake in terms of the booking, which obviously I think had an effect on '88 because nothing was done with it, was you bought the UWF and then you killed everyone.
And I've talked about that before, and I guess I can see in hindsight, and as my mother used to say, if a frog had wings, it wouldn't bump his ass on the ground. In hindsight, yes, they should have done more, but I almost think at that point, Dusty was not necessarily happy that he might have been happy they bought the TVs, but probably wasn't happy they bought the territory, because you had a bunch of towns that weren't drawn and a bunch of guys that had only been pretty much exposed on the television in those towns that he had to integrate all at the same time into his roster at a time where he didn't think that business was going to start sucking.
It's like the one thing people believe is that promotions hate each other. I mean, it would have been a natural thing to do. You had the talent there before the Freebirds left pretty quickly. You started chasing talent off pretty quickly, but you had the talent there to really do something. And it was just a wasted opportunity. And it's not just Dusty too, because obviously you go back and watch some of those TV shows, Eddie Gilbert will do a fired up interview, and then Flair will come out there and just piss all over the UWF guys. But that, to me, when it comes to the end of '87 into early '88, that's like the big thing you have to look at. It's just, forget about even the booking from Starrcade '87. The UWF merger buyout was just completely squandered.
But, and also, once again, look who didn't even come with it.
DiBiase,
DiBiase at that point, Duggan had just gone. That's the problem, is that those guys knew that we can't all just hop in here. It's like a fucking overcrowded lifeboat at that point, and nobody's going to get over, which is why every time something like that happens, unless they focus it on roster versus roster and only the top guys, nobody gets over. You can't just throw that much talent out there. But those guys had already been contacted or had backup plans or whatever, and decided, well, there's already interest in me instead of somebody just bought my territory that I'm working in. So, see ya. But anyway, I agree with you. That could, but at that particular point in time, it was before everything went down. Now, 9 months later, now we got to get everything back up, right? So I just want to read the card, because this is what he started with. I don't mean started with, but started the Great American Bash '88 tour with in Orlando. Larry Zbyszko against Bugsy McGraw, because they still, I think, had Florida at that point, or they still had the Florida guys. They'd already folded Florida.
Yeah, the Florida title was still on Rick Steiner at that point.
Yeah, well, there you go. Fine champion he was. Larry Zbyszko over Bugsy McGraw, Ivan Koloff and the Russian Assassin, who was Dave Sheldon, the Angel of Death, or Jack Victory, one or the other. Probably Dave first. Anyway, Ivan Koloff and the Russian Assassin beat Ron and Jimmy Garvin. The Rock and Roll Express beat the Sheep Herders. Fantastics beat the Midnight Express. Dr. Death Steve Williams beat Kevin Sullivan DQ. Sting beat Mike Rotunda DQ. Al Perez beat Nikita Koloff in a Texas death match. And Dusty Rhodes, Lex Luger, the Road Warriors, and Paul Ellering beat J.J. Dillon, Ric Flair, Tully Blanchard, Arn Anderson, and Barry Windham in what I believe was a War Games, was it not?
It may have been. Do you think any of that made up for the fans having to sit through Zbyszko versus Bugsy McGraw?
We can hope it was brief. I believe it was. But here's the thing. I think that there was probably 6 guys. No, it's 4 guys on that card that pretty much had jobs because their territory had got absorbed and Dusty had a soft spot. Let's put it that way. The house would have been the same, but still the point is, it was a major card with major names, but that was what he had done to hotshot to get the people back into the buildings and back into his programs so that he could continue from there. And he had actually told us we had been working with Fantastics since it was my idea to bring them in March. And that's when Dusty let me do that thing where we put them over in the non-title match and we put them over on TV. And that was my finishes and shit. Because he was letting me play a little bit. And he liked we needed athletic opponents at that point. But then he had told me, kid, you're going to finish up on the Great American Bash. We're going to do the bunkhouses. And they beat me every night. Most of the time, or 10 lashes to the loser, and they'd slip over the boys. And then the final thing was they get to beat me up for all that we've done for them. But he deliberately didn't want to beat the Midnight Express most nights because he said, I got some different shit I want y'all to do. So that means he obviously had thought about the thing with the Horsemen after. It makes sense after we have put over the Fantastics and the blow off where really they beat me up most of the time and the Midnight are still in good shape. And then we go into a program with another heel team that has just recently had the shit kicked out of them in group matches by all the top baby faces, but still are the most over other tag team in the company. And then he's also figured out that Ric Flair and Lex Luger is going to be his summer and his fall. And not only are they're going to do the disputed finish on pay-per-view at the Great American Bash to lead to rematches, which ended up drawing big houses, blah, blah, blah. So he already clearly has a plan because of the things that he came out with and some of the people that after the Bash 88 tour, he weeded off the cards as not necessarily being necessary to the fucking continued success of the company, Al Perez. Or whatever. I'm sorry.
Wow.
I had Tourette's there. But anyway, so we went through. That's what I can see as a booker trying to read his mind, what he's thinking of doing.
Are you okay with War Games as an annual event? I mean, what did you think when they brought it back the second time in '87? And then did you just expect it would be a part of the Bash going forward?
Well, you mean an annual event in every town? I thought they did it a little too much, but I mean, let's face it, he's hot-shotting, and that's what you do. So. Once again, it still didn't hurt War Games. They still had interest in it for years until everybody's completely, fucked it up after that. But he did what he had to do in '88. War Games all around. War Games for everybody. He's buying fan shots. Come on in and see what the fuck I'm doing. You got to get him in there. So he dropped the cow on the Bash tour with all the talent, and those were all stipulation matches. Like I said, ours were bunkhouses. With the 3-on-2 handicap where I'm wrestling or I get lashed or I'm in a straitjacket in the fucking cage or whatever, right? But all those matches were blow-offs and title matches and etc. Greenville, South Carolina does $61,000 the day after we set the record in Orlando. Columbia, South Carolina, June 28th, $47,000, the record. When business has been soft, then we did a couple TVs, etc. But Norfolk, Virginia does $105,000. Charlotte, North Carolina, Memorial Stadium on July 2nd did $98,000. And that was a major disappointment because previous 85, 86 and 87, they'd done over 20,000 people and a couple of $100,000. So that was a big disappointment. But then Amarillo does $50,000. Dallas does almost $50,000. Miami does $60,000. Tampa, $45,000. $101,000 in Raleigh. $80,000 in Pittsburgh. $100,000, almost 10,000 people in Chicago. Baltimore, the pay-per-view, Great American Bash, drew a sellout, 13,000 people, and paid $206,000. So obviously, and that, let's go to that card. because that's obviously of what he had for the planned for the summer. That was the big matches. That was obviously their chance to be on full pay. That was the first full pay-per-view, right, Brian?
Yeah.
The first full coverage pay-per-view. So
yeah,
that had to be the fucking show that he wanted to goddamn present more than any other. And it was, as I vamp and turn the pages. Okay. Rick Steiner and Dick Murdoch beat Tim Horner and Kendall Windham. Nikita Koloff and Sting drew Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard in 20 minutes. The Midnight Express beat the Fantastics via pinfall to win the NWA US Tag title. That's when I was in a straitjacket and in the cage. That was the attraction that I couldn't intervene. But at the same time, he finally said, okay, kid, you had your program, but I got something else for you to do. He puts the belts back on the Midnight Express on the big show. And that means that the only the one that counts, the people saw the heels win and beat the baby faces and get their belts back. Jimmy and Ronnie Garvin, the Road Warriors and Steve Williams beat Kevin Sullivan, Mike Rotunda, Al Perez, a Russian Assassin, and Ivan Koloff in a Tower of Doom match. And that was Kevin's baby that he contributed to the summer. And that was the blow off with all the guys that had been involved in their program. Barry Windham beats Dusty Rhodes. He's obviously positioning Barry to be somebody that's going to be a fucking top heel, whether it be a champion or the challenger to the fucking babyface champion going forward, because NWA World Champion Ric Flair beats Lex Luger via blood stoppage. And that's when Lex was not experienced with or enamored of the blade, right? So it looked more like a pap smear, as we used to say before you couldn't say things like that anymore. But it didn't get over, but he was supposed to be fucking juiced, right? So, and there was a rule in Baltimore with the commission about blood at that point. And they decided, and they did the whole deal. It was trying to be a shoot if it'd been more blood, but at any rate, the point is he knows he's coming out of the summertime with return matches for Luger versus Flair. And probably eventually to put the belt on fucking Luger, potentially, because he's already making Barry a top heel on the other side. So could that be his next champion? He's thinking out in the future. He has basically put the Road Warriors and Dr. Death and the Garvins over the heels in their blow-off match. But all those guys are still strong, but there's plans for those baby faces. Nikita and Sting drew Arn and Tully. They're neutral. And the Midnight Express beat the Fantastics and get the U.S. Tag title back. So all of those people are going to be figured into what he wants to do for the fall to draw houses, right? So that's kind of where we're at. So we continue in July. Huntsville, Alabama does $31,000. Louisville, Kentucky, $25,000. Because Jarrett was still running and we were in Broadbent Arena, which smelled like cow dung. And, the wrestling audience was taken. But Chattanooga did a record at the UTC Arena, $83,000. Richmond, Virginia did $109,000 at the Coliseum, which is pretty close to, at those prices, 9,000 some odd people. Greensboro, North Carolina does $100,000. There you can see another example of in just Greensboro and Richmond or what? Well, I'm asking you, fucking New York bastard. It's a 3-hour drive. And they did over $200,000 for two shows within 150 miles or whatever of each other in the same part of the country with very similar lineups. Columbus, Georgia, $37,000. Macon, Georgia did $61,000. Cincinnati, $84,000. St. Louis, $81,000. Philadelphia on July 23rd did $147,000. So let's take a look at that fucking card.
Yeah, hopefully the team of Kendall Windham and Tim Horner took the night off that night.
Well, you ain't going to believe this. And here's an example of when I say that there is sometimes hot shotting can go too far. You load the card up like at 12 big matches, and there's a questionable cutoff of whether if 6 people had not been on this card, would the fans have set the seats on fire? I said that to Kerry Silkin one time. He was losing money on Ring of Honor live events. I said, list your bottom 6 people, and would the fans have set the seats on fire if those people were not on the card? Anyway, Ronnie Garvin beats the Italian Stallion. Larry Zbyszko beat Bugsy McGraw. Rick Steiner beat Kendall Windham. The Rock and Roll Express beat Sheepherders. Al Perez beat the Mighty Wilbur, Paul Jones's finest. Steve Williams and Jimmy Garvin beat Ivan Koloff and the Russian Assassin. The Fantastics beat the Midnight Express and Jim Cornette in a bunkhouse match. Sting beat Mike Rotunda by disqualification. And in the main event, Nikita, Luger, Dusty, and Road Warriors beat the Horsemen and JJ in the War Games.
Sounds like I'll be rolling up during intermission, and that's when I'll get to my seat.
And basically, but see, once again, with that War Games was such a special attraction, it ate up a lot of talent, but it was so powerful because both those groups meant something. For the past couple of years, they'd meant something together, and they had history intermingling with each other. So that was what drew your house, and then his featured talent was Sting, Rotunda, Midnight, Fantastics, Williams and Garvin, and the Rock and Roll and the Sheepherders. But that's when I think he's mad at Ricky because Ricky wouldn't cut his hair at that point. But anyway, and the rest of the guys were the card, legitimately.
He wanted Ricky to cut his hair?
There was at one point he was going to have the Sheepherders cut his hair, and I think Ricky, that's what started Ricky being on the outs with and them deciding to go elsewhere at one point. But anyway, I digress. The point is $147,000. That was pretty much a sellout in the Philadelphia Civic Center. So he got these crowds back. Roanoke was good. Johnson City was good. Fayetteville was $66,000. It had been $100 a couple years beforehand, but still. Savannah, Georgia, $60,000 almost. Jacksonville, Florida, $66,000. Daytona Beach, Houston, I don't have. Landover, Maryland, the Capitol Center, July 30th, $157,000 house. So 12,000-ish people in a place where Baltimore had just pretty much sold out. Detroit, Michigan did $103,000. The card in Detroit, I will never forget, ladies and gentlemen. Detroit had not been a hotbed for Crockett Promotions. But basically, the whole card pretty much that I just gave you, except the Rock and Roll were gone at that point. It was Ricky Morton and Brad Armstrong. Robert was hurt at that point, I think. Ricky Morton and Brad Armstrong against the Sheepherders. But the same card I just gave you, basically Fantastics Midnight, the Horsemen against the Babyfaces, but Dusty Rhodes and the Sheik against Kevin Sullivan and Dick Murdoch did $103,000, almost 10,000 people, because it was the first time back for the Sheik in the Cobo in like 10 years. And then he demanded they give him 10%, and they didn't give him the $10,000, and he no-showed the next month. But anyway, he got at the same time as he was drawing these houses, and we'll continue. Milwaukee, $48,000. Sioux City, Iowa, did $32,000. Seattle, sell out $96,000. Las Vegas, $48,000. We talked about the Forum in Los Angeles, $78,000. They probably had to pay to get out of there. Oakland, which was not as fancy of a building, $98,000. And that was the Bash Tour. And what he had done is he had hot-shotted the fucking thing and got the people back in the buildings and hopefully gotten them interested in the product and the talent. And he put everybody over that needed to go over in all of their stories and scenarios, but at the same time, he kept his main roster, his team, as he used to say, the people that he wanted to figure in going forward in the fall, he kept them strong in some way in all of those matches, right? Then, I mean, and once again, that's you could say debate whether beating the Horsemen every night until he did debate it, kept him strong, but at least he had a booking plan. They were going into different angles with different people, right? But at the same time, the TBS talks had started and the potential of the sale had happened. And that's when, about that time, they interviewed, the TBS people interviewed some of the top talent. And apparently we were not invited. I think it was basically the Horsemen and like guys like Luger and Sting. We were not invited to be part of this conversation, and maybe they already didn't like our contract anyway. Since we had we were at the time, we were supposedly being the highest paid guys in Crockett Promotions besides Flair, Luger, Sting, and the Road Warriors and Ellering. But we were still getting payoffs from Jimmy. So Tully, kind of as Dennis Corluzzo, you say, put the mouth on Dusty's booking because there was the feeling and everybody has, JJ mentioned this in my fine Back to the Territories release on Crockett Promotions and Mid-Atlantic Wrestling. In 87 and before that, Dusty's manner of booking, which was we're going to have the best workers in the business as our heels, and we're going to be able to get heat on them easy and beat them constantly and still get heat on them, and then have a bunch of charismatic but pretty much athletically limited or green baby faces, except for a guy like a Magnum or a Wyndham, that fucking are our superheroes that the heels make, was naturally trying on the Horsemen as a unit for trying to keep their heat and still be there in line for the triple fucking, curly shuffle elbow or whatever. So often JJ would have to go to Jimmy Crockett and be kind of the office conduit sometimes and go, look, you need to talk to Flair because they're afraid if we take too much heat off of us, we're going to lose this thing. We all know if you lose it, you can't get it back as easy. And so then Jimmy Crockett would kind of arrange a detente where he'd have Dusty and Flair both over to dinner or whatever, and everybody'd be happy, or he'd have Flair over without Dusty and make sure that Rick knew that he was considering their best interests and they were figured in. And, so it was like the fucking mafia families having to sit down to keep the power balance. Well, now there's going to be a new millionaire involved, a billionaire, and the power balance broker is being, Jimmy Crockett is being edged out of the equation. And the point is that there had been festering feelings that the Horseman's heat was too easily expended. And Dusty's thought had been, I'm sure, well, I can get away with it. And then when things went down, he turned around and got them back. So that was his viewpoint. But then he hears that Tully is sometime in the month of August. Tully has put the mouth on him to Turner Broadcasting, saying that he didn't like Dusty's booking or whatever the fuck he said in the supposedly secret meeting that everybody apparently heard about pretty much instantly. And Dusty's response, as we know, Brian, is to ban Tully off of Crockett's private plane. So he has to fly commercial to go to the shows. Which had happened before in certain circumstances when people acted inappropriately, but never just for heat with the booker. Just no plane for you. But but I can see Dusty's viewpoint too. But everybody of its time is under the bridge at that point. But after the Great American Bashes, we have just set records in a number of markets, drawn great houses, proved that we have some appeal most places in the country, but that there's still places that we need to stick to. And it's awful expensive to haul a goddamn whole wrestling show all the way to the West Coast. We'd had like 5 days off after the Bash tour was over with. I think the final date was on August in Kemper Arena, August 7th, Kansas City, Missouri. And I recommend I believe it was the Golden Ox outside the Kemper Arena as a steakhouse. But anyway, we get the rest of the week off and we come back on the following Friday, August 12th. And it was a syndicated television taping for the NWA Pro show. This would aired on August 27th. This was August 12th. So 2 weeks in the future, but I want to show you this card and I want to tell you what it drew. On August 12th, there's partial results here, but the point is it was a 2-hour TV taping, 2 weeks of NWA syndication, right? But there were a couple of dark matches. So Mike Rotunda beat Kendall Windham. Brad Armstrong beat Al Perez by disqualification. Barry Windham beat Nikita Koloff. But the two main events were Lex Luger over Ric Flair by disqualification for the NWA title, and the Midnight Express and Tully Blanchard and Arn Anderson no contest for the World Tag title. Because we had just started doing at the previous TV the fucking promos between me and JJ and then between Tully and Arn and the boys where, hey, we deserve a fucking chance, blah, 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 that whole deal. That Norfolk TV taping drew $98,000 on those two dark matches, Flair and Luger and us underneath. And that was Dusty's plan as he starts, and we're going to skip ahead here a little bit, but we're going to start getting into some of the cards that he had, that he was obviously the direction he wanted to go for the next 4 weeks before shit went south. We had a few more days off that week since, the Bash Tour had pretty much run everybody ragged. And then we did Raleigh on August 18th, and it was a sellout. Raleigh, North Carolina was a sellout the month after we had done pretty much a sellout at higher prices for the Great American Bash, right? And on August 18th, that card was Lex Luger beat NWA World Champion Ric Flair by disqualification. Road Warriors beat Rick Steiner and Mike Rotunda. The Varsity Club and the Warriors were going to be figured in prominently. Arn Anderson, no contest, Stan Lane. And I can't remember why the fuck that would have been a single instead of a tag match, but nevertheless, it was positioned, as a matter of fact, second from the top. So, and we did a double DQ. And Sting beat Al Perez and a couple of other matches. Riggy Morton beat Barry Windham by disqualification. Fantastics beat the Sheepherders. The following night in Richmond, same 2 top matches, Luger and Flair, Midnight and Tully, plus Dusty beats the Russian Assassin. Dusty's getting a win to try to get established with where he wants to go. He's got Barry Windham over Steve Williams by count out. And the Road Warriors beat the Varsity Club. Sting beat Al Perez. $141,000. It sold out the Richmond Coliseum. The month after, the Bash, that's supposed to be the big show, did over $100,000. The return of everybody wanted to see Luger win the belt, and at the time, people thought it could still take place in your arena. Imagine that. So the return of the finish obviously worked, even though everybody panned it creatively. The people were into it. They wanted to see Flair or Luger beat Flair for the title, and a completely new match between their 2 most over tag teams of the last several years that they had never seen before and never knew they were going to get to see. And then once again, the Road Warriors as an attraction on the card with the Varsity Club, 2 guys that could hang with them physically, and Dusty and Windham being figured prominently in Sting. He's setting things up. Philadelphia did $115,000 on August 20th, and that was with the Road Warriors over the Midnight on top by disqualification, and Dusty against the Russian Assassin, Windham and Nikita, and a Sting, Steve Williams, basically Horseman multiple babyface heel match. But $115,000 after Philadelphia had done $147,000. Cincinnati did $52,000. We did a sellout in Sumter, South Carolina on August 23rd for the TV taping. So as you can see, he's content. And then we come back to Charlotte, North Carolina on August 27th, which was the first wrestling event in the new Coliseum that's since been torn down. The old Coliseum's still there. They had cheap general admission to get the people in the new building and drew $102,000, but 13,500 people. And that was for Tully and Arn and the Midnight and Flair and Luger. Greensboro, for whatever reason, it was a TV taping. We were a dark match, was down to $43,000. But the point is, he was continuing his business, and he was setting these guys up. Even in September, Baltimore did $123,000. That was close to a sellout in the Baltimore Civic Center. Detroit, the return from the Bash, did $70,000. And the payoffs were fantastic because those houses we were in basically the double main events. But then the problems start happening. And this is an example of what happens when you lose key people and you have to take somebody else from something that you've planned for them to do to fucking fill in somewhere else. And it just starts a domino effect. On September 10th, in Philadelphia, we came back again. So remember, the houses were $147,000 for the Bash, $100,000 I just called, and now back again the third time in less than 3 months, $72,000 still. And the card was Luger versus Flair, Dusty Rhodes and Kevin Sullivan in a dog collar match, the Road Warriors in a get-over match at Midnight, and Tully and Arn, and Sting and Windham, and a few others, but those were the feature matches. And that was the night that we found out we were winning the belts because Tully and Arn had decided when Tully got banned off the plane, his response was to make a phone call north. And Arn probably figured that, long story short, they went. We find out. So now the Midnight Express are the World Tag Team Champions and the U.S. Tag Team Champions. And our biggest money box office attraction drawing tag team that we've had since the rock and roll is gone. And now Dusty has no horseman. And other things start changing. And now the worm has turned from you can imagine, meanwhile, Crockett had thought in the summertime, wow, business looks good, so they'll think that we kind of knew what the fuck we were doing. And even though they buy us, they were going to keep Crockett in a consultant role. I'm sure he thought he'd probably have a little bit more say in what he ended up having said. At the same time, Dusty thought, I've got the fucking business back up, and now all of a sudden, plump, shit starts happening. And within a couple weeks, I even, by the way, filled in that week in September as a morning show co-host on WBCY Radio in Charlotte when the regular morning team was out of town. But anyway, by the end of the month, houses are kind of down here. Chicago only does $66,000 because now we've gone back with the Fantastics because they're the only team that we really had any history with and that he could plug in with us. And the whole thing with Tully and Arn is gone. And also the horseman dynamic for any multiple person big show matches is fucked. So in October, for example.
Hey, Jim, can I stop you for a second and ask a question?
You better. I'm running out of wind.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. I thought of an anecdote that John Hitchcock told on the Superpodcast. Of course, John sat in front row section D in Greensboro, which was really the core town for Crockett Promotions. And he remembered one time where Flair went in the ring and he, recognized John from all those shows. And he walked over to that area of the ring and he just said, "Where is everybody?" And, John being, a smart fan at the time said, "Well, it's Dusty's booking." And Flair just kind of nodded and then walked off and went back into his strut. But I'm curious how much dissension there was between Flair and Dusty at that time. It seems like from everything I heard, their relationship almost had a complete breakdown because they had been so close. He had wanted to be Dusty's brother. So I'm curious what you saw, how much you think that affected things. And then also based on that, what comparisons do you think there are between the relationship between Flair and Dusty during that period of time and let's say maybe Lawler and Dundee behind the scenes?
It's always the two biggest stars. I don't know if it was the Crusher and Billy Robinson, but it's always the two top guys that have tension, especially when both of them have either booked or have designs on the book, or both of them have been the heel or the baby face and feels comfortable in the other. So whatever the case may be, there's always going to be tension. One's more of a workaholic. The other one feels like it comes natural to him, and it does. There's always and those top guys are always contrasts. If you notice, there's never two guys that are any way similar to each other that are both top guys in the same territory. At any rate, after obviously the Horsemen have split up, and Flair because we've looked at it from Crockett's viewpoint. Oh shit, now there's a chink in fucking business and all this shit's starting to fall apart just for this sales going through. And Dusty's like, oh fuck, I booked the fucking houses back and the people are here and this has got as much interest as we've had in ages. And now this shit's fucking going on. From Flair, you can imagine, goddamn, the Horsemen are fixed to be the goddamn supposedly the main event fucking of heels in this goddamn company still for another big run, and half of them are gone. So everybody's like, what the fuck at this point? And there's always, that's when Dusty figures now, well, the Horsemen are trying to get out to get me. So he starts the idea to bury Flair, right? Which culminates with, according to all the reports we've heard, the idea for Flair to drop the title to Rick Steiner at Starrcade in pretty convincing fashion.
5 minutes is what was always said.
And I don't know if they ever called it that quick or not, but who knows? But then Flair being obviously the guy that Ted Turner bought the company for, because last time he had time to watch wrestling when he wasn't fucking Jane Fonda from behind Doggy Style. Flair was the guy. He didn't know that Dusty, I'm sure he didn't know what the fucking Booker was at that point. Although I'm sure Dusty would have loved to have told him at length. So Flair had to be the key guy, but Dusty felt betrayed, et cetera, et cetera. So all this, so the point I'm making is we see you can't just go back and look at a month. We're setting up for January, folks. We're going to get there in a minute. But you have to go back and look at the year and from different people's perspective. Would Crockett thinking he was running a successful business and finding out I was there? Sandy Scott was there, and I personally was told by Sandy Scott, and I believed him, that at one point Jimmy Crockett walked into Dave Johnson, the accountant's office, which was catty corner from Sandy Scott's door, and came out 10 minutes later white as a ghost when he found out he was $2 million in the hole all at the same time. When they finally fucking caught up and realized what was going on and what money was coming and what wasn't. At any rate, you know, Jimmy goes from thinking everything's cool to, oh shit, to it's coming back, but we can still get the sale, to, oh shit. Everybody's going from up and down and up and down. And so are the houses, because you go to October 15th in Philadelphia, right? So remember, we've done just boffo business in Philly for the past 3 months. This time it was supposed to have been, well, I'll give you the card. Basically, the money drawing matches: Road Warriors against Steiner and Rotunda, Russian Assassins against Ivan and Nikita Koloff, Wyndham and Sting, Midnight Express versus Fantastics, J.J. Dillon versus Jim Cornette in a cage. We were the main event. It was not supposed to be that way. It was supposed to be JJ versus Jim, yes, but Midnight versus Tully and Arn in a cage. But obviously, that was the match that was booked. Because when, I guess people don't even know this, in those days when you booked territory, the previous month on September 10th, when Dusty went in with that show and that card, the finishes that he gave were because he'd already booked the following month's card. Everybody knows that, right? Or is that just a lost art these days?
I think people know that.
So the point is, the original finish was going to be us having a big fucking no contest schmoz like we've been having. So there wasn't going to be a definitive winner, and come back at a cage match where the, you know, et cetera. And then put me in against JJ as a novelty underneath it. Right. Well, goddamn, we ended up being the main event, because when he had to change the match and he had to do it, that since they were gone, you couldn't advertise that whole match for a month. So they had to announce, no, it's going to be the Midnight of Fantastics. So we drew $52,000. And I would like to, and it was a great match with the Fantastics, but think about this. J.J. Dillon and Jim Cornette on top, and the Midnight Express and the Fantastics in the semifinal, we still drew $52,000 in Philly in October. But it's also headed down the fucking primrose path. We've gone from 147 to 115, 72 to 52, right? So let's skip ahead, because November 1st, the sale officially takes place, right? And we have just come off a pretty brutal run of Mid-South towns like Little Rock and New Orleans and Jackson, Mississippi, that didn't draw particularly well, and end up in New Orleans on October 29th. Now, at that point, Dusty has said, okay, I've lost the Horsemen booking-wise, right? The tension's still going on with Flair and the Horseman side. And obviously, Crockett is happy because the sale he knew it was going through at that point. It officially happened November 1st, but I think they signed the papers the week beforehand. But Dusty now is going to try to rebuild again, obviously, because he still wants to be the guy booking this fucking thing. So what is he going to do now that he's lost pieces of his puzzle? In New Orleans on October 29th, the card was the money matches were basically Kevin Sullivan versus Dusty Rhodes. Kevin won by disqualification. Steve Williams over Larry Zbyszko. The Road Warriors over the Midnight Express for the NWA World Tag Title, and Lex Luger beats Ric Flair by disqualification for the World Title. Luger and Flair still had, some legs, and I don't know when he may have tried to pull the trigger on that, or at that point if they were going to. But he's obviously now got to establish a new heel force, and he figures it's going to be the Road Warriors. And so what he told us that night was It was scheduled to be a double turn like it was, but really it was to get heat on the Road Warriors and just sympathy. It was to get sympathy on us just to get heat on the Road Warriors. Because I had already pitched Dust immediately when I went into damage control the previous month when we lost our goddamn Golden Goose opponents, and pitched Dusty the original Midnight Feud to bring in Paul Lee, Dennis, and Randy because we needed opponents. And the angle that we did on TV with him cracking me with the phone and the blah, 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 as everybody knew, I'm not crowing, but was mine. And Dusty let me do it. He had me set it up with the guys and everything. But he knew that we were going to be doing that. And so he knew that we were going to be the baby faces anyway. So he basically sacrificed us in terms of just getting our brains smashed in, all three of us pretty much, by the Road Warriors to turn them heel, because he knew that we were about to do just fucking the next week. As a matter of fact, in Atlanta, a couple of days later, we were going to do the angle with the original Midnight where we would be turned full-fledged babyface. This would get the Road Warriors as world champions so that they could feud with Luger and Sting. It was going to be and Dusty because Ellering was involved. So it was going to be that ultimate babyface and ultimate heel scenario. And then we were going to have a program with the original Midnight. And then, to be quite honest, as you can see from some of the other cards, as I've just read, it was going to be the Kevin Sullivan and the Varsity Club and, you know, probably a rotating cast of a few other baby faces to try to get the thing back off the ground again, right? At that point. Now, in New Orleans, we did 38 grand, which wasn't a bad house. And, of course, they jumped us before the bell. They hurt Bobby. They beat up Stan. Bobby tags in, but the valiant comeback, but to no avail. Boom, just smash 1, 2, 3. So that gets the Road Warriors in the right position. And we go the following week and we do the Atlanta TV angle with the original Midnight. But at the same time, this year, Starrcade was not going to be on Thanksgiving this year. It was going to be at Christmas time because as Turner Broadcasting, I don't remember what all the reasons given were, but the point is they didn't fucking want to run Thanksgiving and they didn't think people would buy the pay-per-view and they wanted to make it a Christmas show. Do you remember any specific input into why they fucked that up?
No.
Anyway, so we lose, as a matter of fact, Thanksgiving Day, instead of, which I'd already written Starrcade 88, because when I would get my 88 book, or I'd get my next year's book, I'd write down Starrcade, right? I scratch it out. On Thanksgiving Day of 1988, we did a television taping in the TBS studios, Techwood Drive. We weren't even at center stage yet. Instead of the biggest drawing gate of the goddamn year, we did a free TV taping where the fans didn't even have to pay to get in, all 100 of them. That's what, all of a sudden, Dusty's trying to do the thing that he thinks he has to do talent-wise. But there's tension with him and Flair, and it's getting worse to where now he's thinking about, well, I'll get this fucking belt off this fucking guy, and I'll get some of the leverage, right? Meanwhile, Flair's not going to roll over and play dead, and he can actually appeal to Ted Turner. Meanwhile, as Dusty figures what else he does for the booking, he wants to get the Road Warriors as absolutely hot as he fucking can, including doing the spike in the eye that eventually was one of the many, straws that broke the camel's back. But in the meantime, also Turner Broadcasting starts making some very questionable decisions. Of course, it's a TV company, so their emphasis is on TV tapings, and it would make the TBS show look so much better when they went to center stage, and it was such a nice looking arena, and it was just more energy. But doing constant TV tapings to satisfy all these masters was starting pretty much off the bat. And also, to be honest, in November, they ran some questionable, besides these TV tapings, as I'm looking at it, some questionable fucking town locations that we weren't that strong in. But I'll give you an example. On November 18th and November 19th, Washington, D.C. did 35 grand, and the Philadelphia show on November 19th, I didn't even record the house. It was a $400 payoff, so it was probably in the $30-something thousand range. Things were starting to, and Stan Lane did singles matches with Mike Rotunda and the Italian Stallion. because I think Bobby was Bobby selling something. I don't know, but we had just been drubbed by the Road Warriors the previous couple weeks to get that deal over, and started the angle with the original Midnight. But all of November is mostly Charlotte. Thanksgiving weekend does a $57,000 house. Greensboro is way down. They sent us out west when we finally heard about Dusty getting fired. We just started that West Coast tour, where it was our first house show run with the original Midnights, which, according to what Dusty had been trying to set up, was going to be the number 3 from the top angle, according to what he'd been doing. And all of a sudden we're there and we're on the opening match, and they tell us go 20 minutes Broadway in Las Vegas and San Francisco and Albuquerque that weekend, and Amarillo. In between that is when we had changed the finish, put the time in, and then done a hot DQ because we were mad about our angle being squashed. And JJ had disciplined us by telling us we had to go home unless we talked to Jimmy Crockett. So then we called Flair, and then we found out Dusty had got fired, and then we called Jimmy Crockett, and then he said, please stay, and we stayed out there and all that stuff. But changes are being made already. Now Dusty's no longer the booker. Jimmy Crockett is the interim booker, and even he told us himself, I'm not a booker. He said, I'm a maintenance booker. I will keep this going, whatever we've got. And he didn't even do that until we get a new booker. And then he promptly changed our angle. So all of a sudden, he didn't like Randy Rose's work. So he's going to find Dennis Condrey a new partner. So now, by the time that I've cut my head with a razor blade 15 times on fucking, and let Paul hit me with that jackhammer brick of a cell phone for an angle that's going 20 minutes Broadway in the opening match and is already being talked about as being changed. And that's just within a few weeks. And December continued to suck, except for the December 7th Clash Champions Seasons beatings. We had the match with Flair and Wyndham. Only time ever that we got to work with those guys in a tag match. and that did well in the ratings. But then Turner Broadcasting determined that they could cut costs. Do you remember the cost-cutting deal, what they did with the managers? They decided, well, to our live, because all of a sudden they didn't really care about the house show.
Was that the Battle Royals, where they put you guys all in Battle Royals?
No. I think actually that Dusty did that probably before. That was probably already penciled in, and they kept it. And it was fun, too. We did a couple. But no, Turner Broadcasting by December had said, well, wait a minute. Why do we need to send all these people to the house shows? Because they didn't give a fuck about the house shows all of a sudden. So we have 6 managers. We can save 6 plane tickets if we don't send the managers, because they don't wrestle, right? So automatically, the original Midnight angle is completely fucked because the angle was the managers, pretty much, to be honest. The Varsity Club, Kevin might wrestle sometimes, but like JJ, he was in the office. Paul Jones with his group, that was maybe not a world beater, but it sabotaged our angle. But more importantly, the house shows started getting less and less love, if you know what I'm saying. They're just the matches might be formulaic, or they might not run the most popular towns, or they might run someplace because we know the building there, especially when they got that idiot Don Glass that used to get coffee for Ed Cohen in the WWF. So already they're starting to, basically what I'm saying is decry the importance of the house show, which is your barometer and your indicator of all those fans you got out there, right? Well, they wouldn't be pretty soon. Anyway, so they don't fly us with the matches in December to the like northeastern towns, but they'll still give us a little payoff. So they're paying us, but they won't fly us there. And that continues more in January. So now I'll say this: by December 26th, Starrcade is the day after Christmas on a Monday. Still $150,000 house, which even at those prices at that period of time, it was going to be 10,000 people in the Norfolk scope on a Monday night. And we found we had the big Midnight versus original Midnight confrontation on pay-per-view and had a nice little match, but I believe it was underneath. And And gosh, I don't have the page in the book, but that was the Flair Luger blow off and some other fucking things. That's when Larry Matuszek had turned down, God bless him, the offer to come, the insulting offer they made to come be the booker. And they were starting to talk to George Scott. So basically, I will open the floor to questions in a second, but we have, from several people's viewpoint, established what had happened in the business the previous year to get us to January 1989, and shown what some of the towns did and what some of the trends were and what some of the people's reactions would be. Do you think we have brought people up suitably on where the fuck everybody was at this point in time?
Yeah, I would say so.
Do you think anybody, and I said this last week, and people, oh, of course I was awake. All two of them said that. Do you think everybody's just zoned out by now because is this too much background, as they would say? Or do you think, because you have to look at this from a variety of options, do you not?
You do. You have to evaluate the landscape.
Well, there you go. So now we get to January 1989, finally. And for those of you who think it's going to be our first 5-hour show, no, it's not, because this is not going to take long, because this is the punchline. When I started looking back last week at, well, we'll do January 89, I looked at January 89, and it sucks donkey dicks. And it's not worth a show. So I gave you all this background to show how that the loss of key talent and the change of creative direction vis-a-vis the booker and a change in ownership all at the same time can destroy a wrestling company that obviously was drawing crowds of 5 figures on a regular occasion all across the country. And 6 months later, here's where we go. January 1st was the Omni, the bunkhouse stampede, the manager's stampede, me and Paul E. and Humperdinck and Paul Jones and Gary Hart and J.J. Dillon. And I was the only babyface, so I had to go over, and they about killed me. But there was almost 10,000 people there because they did the $5 general admission that they would usually do on New Year's Day, and that's a tradition. But then we go the next day, Columbus, Georgia, to a syndicated TV taping, and we do the bunkhouse tape, but it's $11,000. It's Columbus for a TV taping. The next day, Albany, Georgia, stampede and TV taping for more syndication. Then the next day, the 4th, Atlanta TV for air on the 14th. And the next day, January 5th, Atlanta TV, the morning shows that would air on the 7th and the 14th. We're doing nothing but television. We go to Philadelphia, or we were supposed to, on January 6th. But our plane was canceled from Charlotte, so me, JJ, Bobby, Stan didn't get there. Abdullah was off. He was stuck in Puerto Rico. Bam Bam Bigelow was off the card. They were starting to bring in a few different talents, but basically what ended up happening in Philly was Luger won the bunkhouse, and Flair pinned Steiner for the world title, and the Road Warriors and Ellering beat Dusty, Luger, and Sting. But that house was apparently, because they had a snowstorm there, so that house was brutal, right? Like 3,000 people or whatever. But then in Baltimore the next day, the bunkhouse stampede, $63,000. Then we go to the next day, January 8th, Fayetteville, North Carolina, in the afternoon, does $6,000. And Greensboro that night, I don't even have the house recorded, but it was the bunkhouse stampede. Once again, remember last year, wasn't it $100,000? 2,500 people. Flair versus the Junkyard Dog for the title. Luger won the bunkhouse. I won the manager's battle royal, but all of us, just all these things happen at the same time. The interest has evaporated. January 9th, we go to Greenville, South Carolina. Now think about this for a second. Greenville, South Carolina, that's done $100,000 in the past. They did $60,000, as you'll recall, a few months ago, right? The match was me, Stan Lane, and Bobby Eaton against the Road Warriors and Paul Ellering. That's the only, I don't even have the record of the rest of the crowd, or the rest of the card rather, but the house was $3,000. So, I mean, we weren't just the only match. There was a whole card around us. $3,000. And because the Road Warriors were supposed to be heels, but now maybe they're not heels anymore. They got to turn them back. against the babyface Midnight Express that's supposed to be wrestling the original Midnight Express. We have no fucking the booking just went south, right? Columbia, South Carolina for the Bunkhouse Stampede does $23,000. Then Bassett, Virginia, because now what they decided to do was they decided to split the cards up into 2 tours since they had all these wrestlers, and they would make big shows. And then they'd have a small town show crew also. Well, we didn't care because if we were on a small town crew because we were making our contract money, but we knew they were sabotaging us because why take your guys that are making almost $250,000 a piece and put them in Bassett, Virginia when you're running Seattle, right? Which is where they were. So they're in Seattle not doing any business and Portland not doing any business while we're in Bassett, Virginia and Harrisonburg, Virginia not doing any business. But the Midnight and original Midnight drawing $12,000 in Harrisonburg was probably more profitable than the losing effort in Portland, Oregon. So we're in Hillsville, Virginia and Cherryville, Virginia, 11,000, 7,000. Then back for TV in Macon, Georgia and Savannah, Georgia and Atlanta TV. It's 4 days of TV in a row, Monday through Thursday, from the 16th through the 19th. Then to Georgetown, South Carolina on the 20th, while the big tour, hold on, I got to find it here. The big tour was in St. Louis at the Kiel Auditorium, which didn't draw, which, as I remember, was of consternation to Jim Hurd, who had joined the company on January 3rd. And we're in Sumter, South Carolina. Now, at this point, Dennis is living in Colorado, and he's starting not to fly back for a couple of these spot shows like in Elberton, Georgia, or whatever the fucking case. But listen to the cards and listen to the difference. For example, in St. Louis, Missouri on January 20th, what didn't draw? Ric Flair versus the Junkyard Dog NWA title. Luger and Sting versus NWA Tag Champions, the Heel Road Warriors. Barry Windham versus Eddie Gilbert for the U.S. title. Steve Williams and Mike Rotunda versus Rick Steiner and Dick Murdoch. And Abdullah the Butcher against Steve Casey and Michael Hayes against the Cruel Connection. That was in St. Louis. So all of a sudden, they're bringing in new talent. They're running off other talent. They're splitting the talent up. They're running ill-advised towns. And, for example, on January 21st, while we were in Sumter, South Carolina, they were in Kansas City and did what I think may be one of the bigger houses of the month, 4,600 people. But at the same time, they go to St. Petersburg the following day and draw 2,000. So anyway, we finish up the month. We're in Kenansville, North Carolina, Washington, North Carolina at these small spot shows. They run Charleston at the Civic Center, West Virginia, and draw 2,500 people. Richmond drew 3,000 people. On January 28th, Richmond, Virginia drew 3,000 people in the same building where we had just sold out in September in 4 months. And we were actually on that show with the original Midnight and Midnight. That's one of the only original Midnight and Midnight matches where we actually both of it, because we both drove, me and Paulie, to get there because they still weren't flying the managers to a lot of these places, which they ended up starting to do in February after they'd already killed us off. But at any rate, Richmond, $36,000. $36,000. Norfolk, the night before, Norfolk, Virginia. Remember the Scope, the Starcade? It did $150,000 the month before.
Yeah.
$12,000. $12,000, pal. They just didn't want to see this shit anymore. And so then basically we finished up the month with doing another couple of TV tapings in Chattanooga and Marietta, and the house show business plummeted from there because there's where they brought in, right at this time, George Scott came in right at the end of the month. The good thing he did was bring Steamboat back, obviously, but it just fell in a hole, and they couldn't find their way again. They couldn't grab it. And they couldn't promote the towns right. They couldn't book the towns on the right schedules. The people didn't care suddenly about the talent. They'd seen too many changes and things they didn't understand. It was too abrupt. They pulled out of their core markets, but the core markets wouldn't draw anymore when they tried to run them because they had previously abused them, and then they'd taken Starcade away and they'd fucked with that. It was too much change too quick and ill-advised people on all parts doing it. And that's how you dismantle a fairly hot fucking wrestling promotion in 6 easy months. Now you see why I didn't want to do a whole show on January? The whole reason that we did the show was what happened the year before that to get to that miserable of a January. And they never recovered. I mean, not until the modern era. They didn't recover under Herd for 3 years. They didn't recover it from October, November 1988, and they first started making a profit in, 97? 9 years?
Yeah.
Because then they started showing life in 96 when they got Hogan and etc. But they still weren't making any money because they were so far in the hole.
Well, no, I think the timeline maybe because Hogan went there in 94, 96 is the NWO. I think maybe it was a little bit earlier.
Well, actually, they started. I should have said they started with 96 with the NWO because they didn't start making any money when Hogan got there. They just started losing money to different people. One of them being Hulk Hogan. Remember, he wasn't an automatic profit maker. Remember, they would cost him money when they sold his T-shirts.
But the Hogan deal was unique because it was really the turning point in a relationship where all of a sudden Turner paid for Hogan's contract. It didn't come out of WCW's budget. And then that's right around the time also that was the situation that Turner Home Entertainment kept all of the pay-per-view money up until that point. It didn't actually go to WCW. It went to Turner Home Entertainment.
Don't quote me on that specific thing, but the gist of it was that WCW did not get credit for all the ancillary revenue that it brought in terms of television programming that they didn't have to pay any rights fee whatsoever, whether it be pay-per-view income past paying the talent and et cetera, or whatever but the more stuff went on the Turner books that the wrestling company directly was responsible for until later on when Bischoff got in good with them. And then they started getting all that stuff. But that was how quick things fell. And even though people remember 89 as a great year and for those major shows and for match quality, definitely with Flair and Steamboat and Flair and Funk. But it was, as we've covered in the past, when Flair took the book, we had a brief resurgence from around September, October of 89 to early 90 in terms of the TV ratings and in terms of the big show attendance, but the house show business was still shitty. And Flair's tenure as booker with myself and Kevin was the most successful they had of any type for the first 3 fucking years. So the house show business never really did recover until the mid-90s. Flair, like I said, Flair got TV ratings and pay-per-view buy rates and the big show houses back up a bit, and then they fell further in the hole through 91 and 92, and they struggled until, finally it just
They stopped doing house shows.
They stopped. Well, as a matter of fact, I was out drawing Smoky Mountain Wrestling in 93 and 94. My Knoxville shows were out drawing some of the shows they ran in the Omni in Atlanta. So, yeah, so they stopped that for a while. And then finally they, Bischoff talked them into spending some money. They got Hogan. And then the key was the NWO, the invasion angle done right, or done as close as you can legally do to right. So thank you, Jim Herd and TBS, for milking us for 6 fucking years. So when you gave us even something half-ass good, we'd appreciate it. Well, there you have it. But if anybody wants to know how to tear down a fucking wrestling promotion, we've given them a pretty good idea today in this special extended episode